Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever time you may be watching or listening, and welcome to episode 10, the final episode of the Carving It Up U.S. President's Edition. I am Bryson Carver. My co-host Isaac Lawson will be joining in just a second. And what a ride it has been throughout this series. This has been a project that the two of us, myself, my co-host, have been working on since like Christmas of last year. So it's been 9 episodes doing research on each president. And all of that was obviously to sort of express our love of presidential history, but also to sort of give you the listeners and the viewers a taste and a view of what these complex individuals were like as men, as leaders, as presidents, what they did do, what they in some cases didn't do. And so sort of give that perspective. So we went from Washington all the way to the current president, Joe Biden. And then today, this is, like I said in earlier episodes, this is where the fun starts. Isaac Lawson, myself, we're going to be ranking presidents, right? He's got his list, I've got my list, and we're going to break it down worst to first. Who's the greatest president? Who's the worst? And so, without further ado, let's get Isaac Lawson on right now. Isaac, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. It's
Man,
it's
yeah.
crazy that this is the last episode already. I feel like, we've, like you said, we've been working on it since December, but it just feels crazy that, it's wrapping up now.
I know, man, and this is, like I said, this has been a just absolute thrill to do this series with you, and sort of, I guess to kind of maybe not give a perspective that nobody's ever heard before necessarily, but kind of I guess give as fair of an assessment as possible with each president. And you've obviously done a phenomenal job, and with your research. And so basically, what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be ranking our presidents. And before we even go into the list or anything like that, what was I'll say first, and then I'll give you the opportunity to explain. But like the criteria of ranking presidents, basically the way I did it, and I kind of gave a little teaser about this. I think it was when we were talking about Ronald Reagan a couple episodes ago. Basically, I said, where was the country when you came into office, and where was it when you left, and how much of an impact did you have on that? Because in some cases, maybe the president doesn't have a ton of influence on the changing, whether it be the changing of the times and technology, and whether or not they have the majority in Congress. Like, there's a lot of different factors that go in besides just the president going in there and doing whatever he wants. Obviously, we know that's not how it works. But sort of your criteria, like what sort of was your thought process when you made your list?
Yeah, there were a couple things that I tried to take into account. I won't lie, and I'll be honest, for some of them, there are a few of them that I probably put higher than I should have just because I like them. But for the most part, the things that I was trying to consider was how many things that they set out to do were they able to complete. Were How do the American people, in the immediate aftermath, or even now, like looking back, are they generally viewed as kind of successful in a positive or negative light? And then the last one that I used was what kind of extraordinary circumstances played into their presidency, and how did they respond to them?
I think it's a great way to do it, because a lot of times we talked about this. I don't remember which episode we talked about it in, but in most cases, I think it was when we were talking about FDR,
Mhm.
when presidents that are ranked at the bottom, are usually consistently ranked at the bottom of every list, every historian that makes these lists, usually more times than not, it's presidents who were faced with the crisis and handled it horribly, and
Mhm.
then it's vice versa with the greatest presidents. And so I mean, yeah, that's really what it comes down to. So man, if you are ready, let's go and break down the list. We're going to start with your list. Basically, how we're going to do this before we show the graphics and everything.
Mhm.
Uh, we're basically going to do this in 8 president spurts, if you will, right? Like, so like from number 37 to 44. Obviously, we're not going to be ranking President Biden, because the current president is never ranked by any historian, because they're obviously not their term isn't completed. But let's go and look at Isaac's list, number 37 through 44. Let's put it up right now. And so
Yes.
for 37 to 44, you've got, in this order, Andrew Johnson, Zachary Taylor, Donald Trump, John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, William Henry Harrison, Franklin Pierce, and finishing off with the guy who is almost always at the bottom of the list, James Buchanan. Poor James, but he did earn that last spot. There's no question about it. But talk about sort of your thought process and why you rank these men where you did.
I'll start with the very bottom. I actually had a lot of trouble about whether I wanted to put Pierce or Buchanan last.
Hmm,
And the reason why I put Buchanan last and not Pierce is because I feel sympathetic towards Pierce. um,
I got you. Yeah,
uh,
who couldn't?
yeah, Buchanan, he deserves that last place spot because he didn't accomplish much of anything of what he wanted to accomplish going into the office. There's nothing that he's really well known for. And he did not respond well at all at the looming threat of secession, or neither was he able to lower the tensions surrounding the issue of slavery. And I don't want to put all the blame for the Civil War on him because it definitely doesn't all belong on him. But there were a lot of things that he could have done in his position as the leader of the nation to help try to deter that movement, and he just didn't step up to the plate. Um, for Pierce and Harrison and Fillmore, I'll lump them together, but for different reasons. Um, they're just not. It's not that nothing important happened while they were in office. They're just not very important. There's nothing super notable, and the things that aren't necessarily good. I think, especially for Pierce, there's the extraordinary circumstance there
Right.
with the tragic death of his son, but there's just nothing there. Harrison dies really early. Fillmore, there's just not a lot of substance to his presidency.
Hmm,
um when you get up to Tyler's another one that I felt conflicted about where I should put him, because I think when I talk about those extraordinary measures again, he did respond to the crisis of who would succeed Harrison. He responded to that well
hmm.
in the long term. I was looking at it now, but when it came to other issues, he had terrible relationship with Congress. He didn't get hardly anything done, and in his post presidency, which maybe isn't fair to include on this, he did side with the Confederacy, and I
Yes.
think that just reflects on his legacy overall poorly, despite the one area of importance that he handled well. Um, for President Trump, I think for that one I took into how did the public feel when they were in office versus afterwards, and I think that it was just a very divisive time, and I think that. And we discussed some of this in the episode that some of it may not be fair critiques for some things with COVID because it was
Sure.
one of those things that is hard to manage. But looking back on it, I think there are a lot of missteps that probably could have been handled better, and there was at least a fair amount of chaos within the organization of his administration. For Taylor and Johnston, I would again put them with the. I think Taylor died, but I think that both of them were slightly more successful in getting some things done. But Taylor's low just because again wasn't an officer long before his death, and Johnson had a bad relationship with Congress, and I think some of his handling of Reconstruction obviously was not the best. So they all are down there for different reasons, but all kind of similar things where could have stepped up more or didn't handle issues well or died or had some terrible tragedy. So
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a lot of historians, if we're talking about the very bottom of your list, a lot of historians do debate, whether it's Pierce or Buchanan. Consistently
mhm,
has, for the most part, been Buchanan because of the fact, I think more than anything, because it was under his presidency that, South Carolina, did secede from the Union, which of
mhm,
course led to multiple other Southern states doing so. But obviously, I've always had the belief that if you are ranked below William Henry Harrison, you were a truly god awful president because the man he didn't do anything. I mean,
no, that's
he
what I
was
said. Well, and that's why I had a little bit of
yeah,
trouble with Harrison too, because I was like, maybe in some ways, maybe Harrison should be the top of the list because he didn't do anything. I almost
right.
was like, I'm not even sure if it's fair to put him on the list, but
Well,
um,
that's the thing. Like, I feel like William Henry Harrison is like the bar between really mediocre presidents and just absolute,
mhm,
you know, awful administrations. The country was in a worse spot when they left. And yeah, I mean, I think you can make good points about Zachary Taylor. The thing is, I would argue because I remember the episode we did. I think it was episode 3. We
mhm,
covered Taylor through Lincoln. So let's just put Lincoln to the side. I think of the other 4 that we talked about, Taylor probably, again, it's, we could always speculate, probably had the highest potential to have a fairly, not even, I mean, say successful, but a decent presidency.
Hmm.
Part of it might have been just because of the time he came in. There wasn't
Hmm.
quite the threat of secession yet, but it was certainly bubbling up in some areas. And so you have that, obviously, and Andrew Johnson, as you mentioned, did have a terrible relationship with Congress. He was the first president to be impeached. And like you said, like John Tyler, like part of me wants John Tyler to be like third to last, but
Hmm.
just in front of Pierce and Buchanan because of his post presidential life in joining the Confederacy. But yeah, I mean
and
that's
and really for
yeah,
Tyler, like I said, the only thing that's really propping him up is his handling of Harrison's death, which was
right.
really good. And that's why some of these are kind of tricky, because I look at them. I'd said to you when we were making our list, I said, there are some where I'm like, I can see arguments for putting them in different spots,
Mhm.
which makes it a little bit tricky. But
No, there's no question, and that's again that's the fun part about making these lists. And the thing about these lists too, before we move on to my 37 through 44 rankings, is that if you look at just 5 years from now, the list will look probably pretty different. I mean, think about a
mhm,
guy, for example, we'll obviously get to him later, but think about Woodrow Wilson. I would say 15 years ago or so, just not that long ago, he was considered like a fringe top 10 president.
yeah,
And then, in recent years, he has just absolutely plummeted. Once I guess some of the more modern historians have really looked at his, like really given a critical look to his 8 years in office. So,
mhm.
um,
And it's also one
yeah.
of those things, like I'll say I have Trump near the bottom here.
Mhm.
But I think, there's some, and we talked about this in our last episode, where, the closer you get to it, the more relevant that it is, the harder it is to judge them. Because,
Mhm.
I don't know what the view of, like, because Trump is our last president to leave office since Biden has come in. I don't know what the view of him is going to be, say, 10, 20 years from now.
Right.
We're only 2 years removed from his presidency.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, and obviously you made a good case for him, and as well as the other seven on this list. So let's transition now. I'll give you my number 37 through 44. Fairly similar to yours. I do have
Mhm.
one name slotted in there, a little different. So from 37 to 44, I've got Herbert Hoover, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, Donald Trump, Millard Fillmore, Andrew Johnson, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. Again, Pierce and Buchanan are in the exact same spots as you had
Mhm.
them, for similar reasons.
I
With
think Fillmore is in the same spot as well.
Fillmore as well. Yes, you're correct. The thing with Pierce too, you got the Kansas Nebraska Act, which was one of the worst pieces of legislation ever passed that he was pressured into sponsoring. You
Mhm.
have with Buchanan, I believe I think if I'm not mistaken, I think he supported the was it the Confederate Constitution or something like that, the Confederate Declaration of Independence. Like he didn't completely condemn it,
Mhm.
which made it feel like he was like a sympathizer to the South. And with Andrew Johnson, the reason I have him third to last is okay. You obviously got the impeachment and got how he didn't get along with Congress, but Andrew Johnson comes in. Obviously, he wasn't elected. He comes in after Lincoln is assassinated, but he is a president at a crucial time in America, Reconstruction, and he really handles the issue kind of it's a rocky 4 years
Uh-huh.
of him in office, for all those reasons. And again, he pretty much alienated himself from Lincoln's cabinet. Part of that was because he was a Democrat, obviously, and it was
Mhm.
a split ticket in 1864. But I think what it comes down to with him is just the complete inability to get along. He was unbelievably stubborn. So that's why I have him where I have him. Millard Fillmore, again, there's not a whole lot of substance there. He was only in the office for 2.5 years, taking over after the death of Zachary Taylor. But you've got, I believe, it was the Compromise of 1850, which was not quite as damaging as the Kansas Nebraska Act, but pretty darn close. And he sort of had the view that, obviously, in the times of slavery, he sort of had the view that the issue with slavery wasn't slavery; it was the fact that you had the abolitionists constantly bringing it up, and he seemed to have an issue with that. So he's obviously very low. Trump, the thing with Donald Trump is, obviously, you talk about the very kind of chaotic, divisive 4 years in office. And again, who knows how he'll be viewed a long time from now.
Mhm.
My sort of thing with Trump is it's really really difficult to get to get January 6th out of my psyche. Like that's not something you can just kind of move on from. And obviously we know that the hearings are going on, so we'll see what comes out of that.
I
But
think also with Trump, I think, and I talked about how things were kind of chaotic, but I think it's just, you even think just with like news cycle and stuff, and
Mhm.
I think that feeds itself a little bit. But when you look at it, just even the difference to this administration, which I don't, not to get too much in, not to try to get into current events or anything, but
Yeah,
which I don't think is necessarily like the most smooth, non-chaotic administration
sure.
ever. Just that tone shift is so drastic in the way that I feel like literally 24-hour news felt very, very much 24-hour, and it feels much more casual now. And I think that that's just because it was. I think it plays, and we talked in the episode about him being a reality TV star. I think that plays into it. I think that that's the way that he was used to kind of doing PR, and I think that's just, it just wears people out.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, I do remember like uh it felt like it felt like it was something every day, like
Hmm.
so that's where I've got him there. John Tyler 39th again for the reasons you mentioned. Not just, I mean, John Tyler did something that was basically, or it did two things unprecedented. One was certainly for the good, as you mentioned, with how he handled Harrison's death. And it was, again, Harrison was the first president to die in office. And so there's this big question because the founding fathers never really discussed the issue. Hey, what if one of us dies in office? Who
Hmm.
who succeeds us? And John Tyler really sort of takes the ball and says, no, I'm the guy in charge now. His issue was, I mean, from the get-go when he comes in office, he is completely unwilling to get along with Harrison's cabinet.
Hmm.
And basically, after vetoing two bills that Harrison, it is expected, would have signed into law, he's basically kicked out of the Whig Party, which I don't think has ever been done before or since, certainly to a sitting U.S. president. And so he's just sort of alienated from Congress, from Harrison's cabinet, and nothing of substance really gets done. So I've got him at 39th. Again, Harrison at 38th. Again, it's there's nothing to judge. He died a month in office.
Hmm.
And then for Herbert Hoover, I've got Hoover at 37th. Some might say, well, he didn't cause the Great Depression, so why do you have him at 37th? My thing with Hoover is I felt like the leadership could have been better
Hmm.
throughout the Great Depression. Some of it was he wasn't as good of a natural public speaker as, say, his successor FDR was,
Uh,
but it was sort of the issue with Hoover was he did a really, really poor job of exuding public confidence, and some of the policies that he put in place certainly wasn't at all successful. And certainly, sort of one of the reasons you mentioned about how you ranked your presidents, about how they're viewed.
mhm.
There's not that many presidents ever that have been in office that have been viewed as low as Herbert Hoover was. So that's why I've got him in my 37th spot. What's kind of your thoughts on that?
Mine, I'll talk elaborate on a little bit more when we get to my ranking of Hoover.
Mhm.
Um, some of mine, I will admit, he's one that a little bit of personal bias comes in because and I'm confident I said in the episode as well that I feel kind of bad for Herbert Hoover.
Oh, it's,
um,
it's tough. He was in a tough position. I'll
and
give him that.
and he was such a good guy.
Yeah.
But the reason why I put him a little bit higher is just because, even as president, he did work towards a lot of humanitarian work that is often overlooked, and I think that that's something that I could give him credit for. And he was, when it came to trade, he was really, really good at trade issues, which he tried to use to help with the Great Depression, and it just didn't pan out. Um, so I just have, I have a more sympathetic view towards him, which did interact with mine a little bit. And I don't know. He's still on the lower half of my list. I think he's
Yeah.
in the next slide. Um, but mine was just more because I was like, well, as opposed to some of the people on here, like say Buchanan or Pierce, he tried to do something, it just didn't pan out. And that's opposed to even like a Johnson who would like tried to do things, but he couldn't build consensus, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Um, Hoover's just didn't work, which isn't good either, but
Yeah.
I feel like is a little bit different form of failure.
Oh, sure. And I mean, you certainly met that case. And the thing that you mentioned about those other presidents you mentioned, they had a lot. They had, let's put it this way, they had more to do with their demise than Hoover did. I don't think anybody would argue that. So yeah, that's where I've got the list. And again, like I said, it's I mean, William Henry Harrison is the toughest president to rank, because obviously, he's near the bottom, but what do you do with 31 days in office? So that's sort of our rankings for the so for like really the bottom of the barrel presidents. And again, sort of the consensus thing, that the belief that I've had is most. Let me put my list back up. Yeah, basically all of them. Again, Harrison aside, basically all of them dealt with a certain crisis, and it didn't feel like that they did a good enough job of not just exuding, confidence in the American people, but just certain decisions that they made that only made the problem worse.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of where I got it. But yeah, that's where we got our bottom presidents from 37 to 44. Let's go now from number 29 to number 36. We'll again go back to Isaac Lawson's list. So he's got, in order from 29 to 36, he's got Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, Benjamin Harrison, Herbert Hoover, Martin Van Buren, James A. Garfield, Rutherford B. Hayes, and Woodrow Wilson. So, yeah, I guess starting from Wilson and going to Nixon, tell me why you have these men where you have them ranked.
Wilson, I feel like maybe I use my personal bias a little bit too much in some of these. Wilson, I said in the episode, don't like him, one of my least favorite. But I think, and as we discussed in the episode, I think that a lot of people overblow the way that he handled World War One. I think that there are good things there, but I don't think his personal involvement is as significant as people make it out to be. I think that there's a good argument that he probably, if he was going to have the U.S. be involved in the war, should have done it sooner, and that his action was a little too slow. And then the biggest issue with Wilson is just how racist he was and the racist
Yes.
policies he put in place, like resegregating the military and other parts of the federal government after they had been desegregated in Teddy Roosevelt's administration and Taft's administrations. Um, the playing of Birth of a Nation at the White House, and playing that for his cabinet, and clearly promoting that lost cause narrative amongst the highest officials of the U.S. government. Those are all things that I think are highly significant errors in his presidency. And I think it's fair to throw in as well that he had the stroke, which left him essentially out of power for around the last year of his administration.
Yeah,
So I think all those kind of tie in to putting him at the lower end of my list.
sure.
Um, for Hayes, he when he was elected president, he was the first president to lose the popular vote. If people remember the Hayes Tilden compromise,
Mm-hmm.
and that his presidency resulted in the end of oh my goodness, the end of
Reconstruction.
Reconstruction.
One thing
Yes.
before you continue, I believe it wasn't Hayes the second, because I think John Quincy Adams won the popular vote in
Um,
1824, right?
yes, but it's a little bit different because John Quincy Adams, um, the election with him went to Congress because the Electoral College didn't have enough votes
Gotcha.
to elect one candidate, if that makes sense.
Right.
So that's why they're similar problems, but they're considered different. Um, so yes, but no.
Yeah,
um,
sure. No, I got you.
and that resulted in he was almost, when he was going into office, there were fears that there would be a coup against the government. He, again, at the end of Reconstruction, I think, was disastrous enough, and I don't think that he had um, the leadership, um, the strength of leadership within him to be able to lead the nation through the beginning of a post-Reconstruction era to protect civil rights, and he didn't. And I think that's why he only served one term. I think he recognized that. But I think that it was overall just a disastrous administration. Um, Garfield, I'm a big fan, but he died in office. I couldn't help him out more than I could
Yeah.
here. He had a little bit more time than some that died in office, but there's just not a lot of substance there. I put him a little bit higher because he was better on some issues like civil service reform and civil rights, and he started movements there, which both were, well, one of those issues was taken up by his predecessor, which we'll get to later. So I put him there just because, trying to be fair with those that didn't really have time to do anything.
Mhm.
Um, For Van Buren, I put him low because of his carrying out of the Indian Removal Act, the frustrations growing in the country during the time, especially in regards to the economic situation, which he did virtually nothing to address. He was very much kind of a do whatever the party tells him to do, um, relatively ineffective leadership. People didn't really have confidence in him. Um, Hoover, I is still on my lower end for the same reasons that you had said, and like I said before, I feel bad for the guy. I think that he made attempts to do things and it just didn't really pan out. Um, and I would agree that he did not do a good job of um, reassuring the public. I think there was a reason the Hoovervilles were named after him.
Mm, right.
Um, Benjamin Harrison is down here. While there's nothing in particular off the top of my head that I can think of that was like really bad that he did while he was president, he was not popular. He lost the popular vote. He was voted out and replaced with the same guy that he had beat. Um, he there just wasn't a lot of momentum to his presidency. It's pretty forgettable. Um, Carter is low, even though great guy. The economy fell apart while he was president. You have the Iranian hostage crisis, even though there's some big diplomatic moves there, like we'll see with Nixon in a second. And I had trouble which way I wanted to place Carter or
Sure.
Nixon. Um, but I put Carter lower just because even though Nixon is remembered really poorly, um, I just kept thinking that right now, um, anytime there seems to be kind of any economic woes, people's fears are that we're going to go to it's going to be like when Carter was president.
Right.
And I think that that says a lot about the general mood of the country during his presidency and how they feel like he played into that. And he was someone else who I think his messaging was off while he was president. I think he
Yeah.
did a bad job of relaying his message to the American people. Nixon, I think, is low for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
uh, Watergate is, really bad. First president to ever resign office. I maybe put him too high, but I think I he won, one of the largest reelection victories in American history. His trip to China was huge. There were some notable moves with um, the USSR at the time, but there are also things outside of Watergate, like the bombing in Cambodia, which you know wasn't necessary, and he knew wasn't necessary, and resulted in civilian deaths. So that's like a really complex placement,
Yeah.
because I went kept going back and forth on where to put Carter or Nixon, and I still kind of am, but for both of them, a lot of it plays into um, some failures in office and then also public perception of their presidencies.
Okay. No, you make great cases for all these. You obviously talk about Woodrow Wilson, and I do agree. Obviously, you talk about World War One. Again, we were not even close to as involved in the first one as we were in the second. Obviously, under FDR. And again, not only did you have that, and my issue with Wilson that I'll sort of detail when I get to him in my rankings is that sort of his inability to compromise with the League of Nations. Like he was absolutely unwilling to
Mhm.
move at all on that. And so you have that. Obviously, you talk about the stroke that happened with about a year and a few months left in his administration, which only made the problem worse. Rutherford B. Hayes, you make a great case for him as well. I mean, you're talking about somebody who is, obviously you got the I forgot what was the deal called that got him elected.
Um, I was trying to think of that too. I know people say the Hayes Tilden compromise, and it's like the great. I think it's the great something. Is it the Great Compromise?
It might be the Great Compromise. I'm trying to find it in my notes from previous episodes, but let's see. I've got it down here somewhere. Let's see. Uh, let's see. No, can't seem to find it.
I'll
But
look for it while you keep talking.
yeah, I appreciate that. But the thing for Hayes obviously is he does again some of the and some of the things for these presidents is just simply timing.
Mhm.
But the issue for Hayes is obviously he removes the troops from these former Confederate states, which gives way for their governments to institute Jim Crow laws, which would of course go on for nearly a century after that
Mhm.
and oppress black people. So that's obviously easily the biggest mark on his administration, and it was quite chaotic, to your point. And Garfield, obviously, it's not quite as similar to Harrison because some things did get done, as you mentioned, civil service reform and civil rights, and look, he did. He sort of, when he came into office, he wasn't somebody who was necessarily known to have a ton of backbone, but he goes at the stalwarts, the wing of the Republican Party led by
Mhm.
Roscoe Conkling, and kind of breaks them up in a way.
Yeah.
And so he deserves immense amount of credit for that. Van Buren, I totally agree with you. People talk about the Indian Removal Act. Obviously, that was, I believe, it was signed by Andrew Jackson, but it was carried out by
Mhm.
Martin Van Buren. You, of course, have the 1837 collapse, and obviously just the cotton market is completely falls apart. And like you said, Van Buren was the type of guy to try to please everybody, but at the end he really didn't please anybody.
Mhm.
And Herbert Hoover, again, at 32, I'm not like going to fight you about him being 5 spots off of mine, because again, like you mentioned, again, sort of similar to Hayes in some ways, because he does come into a really bad situation where the Great Depression occurs, the fall in the stock market happens in October of 1929, which is 6 months after he takes office. But again, it was not just the policy, but it was also his messaging. And for this sort of the same reason you put Carter where you put him, Benjamin Harrison. I mean, like you said, that you can't really think of anything that was awful when he was president. But again, it's just kind of an ineffective guy. He was a little aloof, didn't necessarily work great with Congress.
Mhm.
Um,
And he definitely didn't have public confidence.
yeah. No, he didn't. And the thing with Jimmy Carter too, it's similar to Harrison and to Hoover. Again, not a great job of conveying their message, not a ton of public confidence in them. And so you have that aspect to it. And there were certainly some foreign policy accomplishments, without a question, but domestically, it was there were some very rough days in the Carter administration, and then Richard Nixon at 29th. I mean, look, it's hard to get rid of the elephant in the room, being
Mhm.
Watergate, as well as there was plenty of other sort of shady backroom deals that he did.
He just had a very Nixon is interesting because he just has like a very highs and lows as president. And
Yes, he
I
does.
think that's why he's hard to rank, because there are things that I'm like, this like was genuinely really good, and then
Right.
there's also several big problems that are like, oh, this is like bad.
Well, yeah. Well, let me ask you this question about Richard
Mhm.
Nixon. Do you think, remove all the illegal acts, remove Watergate, which is kind of difficult to do, but let's just say those never occurred and he carries out his 8 years in office, because of course
Mhm.
he was elected to a second term. Do you think he is? I think he's probably in the top 20. Do you think he, dare I say, he's pushing top 15?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think the real question is if he was able to carry out his term, what happens in Vietnam? I think that's the big question. But I think, like, overall, a lot of the policies that were carried out during his administration were very popular. He had some really big wins. Um, so long as we have the foresight of knowing what comes next. But if he was able to steer the economy in a positive way, to kind of stop the woes of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, and if he was able to um, ramp down Vietnam, or find some way to have some sort of solution to Vietnam, then I think you're again pushing top 15 at least.
Yep. I mean, that's why I suggested that, because I mean, obviously you talk about his foreign policy accomplishments with, obviously you did have North and South Vietnam. Again, they agreed to stop fighting, but then you had Nixon sort of got involved, and it was just a big mess. You guys can listen from a few episodes ago when we talked about Nixon. So yeah, I mean, I think you make great cases for all these. Again, usually, these presidents that you mentioned are around the same spots that we have them. So let me pull up.
I'll say real quick.
Sure,
I searched for Hayes. What I found some that say the Great Compromise, but most of them say compromise, just the Compromise of 1877.
gotcha,
So.
gotcha. Okay, so yeah, then that's obviously something that is a huge mark on Hayes, and frankly a mark on both parties for how
Mhm.
that transpired. Moving now to my list, numbers 29 through 36. I've actually got Van Buren and Garfield in the same spots you do at 33 and
Uh,
34. But from number 29 on down to 36 in this order, I've got Gerald Ford, Grover Cleveland, Chester Arthur, Richard Nixon, Martin Van Buren, James Garfield, Zachary Taylor, and Warren G. Harding. Starting with Harding, obviously he dies in office 2.5 years after he comes in. And sort of similar, he's almost like the Richard Nixon of the 1920s in some ways,
Mhm.
because he comes in and there's plenty of domestic accomplishments that he has, while in office. And I believe he was the first president to travel to Alaska. And so there's
Mhm.
certainly some notable events in the short time that he occupied the White House. But after his passing, all of the things you had Teapot Dome, you had the affairs. Now you could argue that some of these didn't have a huge impact on his management style and how successful or not he was as president. But again, I think when there's just 2 years after you're gone, the public kind of hates you.
Mhm.
I think that factors a lot into where I ranked him. I've seen some lists have Harding in the bottom 5. I think that's a touch too low.
Yeah.
But I feel like 36 was a good spot to put him. Zachary Taylor again, number 35. The thing with him was he was to a certain degree willing to stand up to his own party, sort of like Garfield, like where they weren't necessarily known for doing that. But the issue with Taylor was he frankly doesn't know that much about politics. He
Yeah.
didn't vote in his own election. He seemed to have a very and look, I guess to be fair, he was only the 12th president, not the 34th. But he sort of has this blasé. You can see in the picture right there. He's kind of disheveled, not very well put together.
Mhm.
And I think that really reflects his leadership style and how he was in the brief time that he was president. James Garfield, again, I like you, am sort of a Garfield sympathizer. I think he could have been a very good president had he had the opportunity to finish his term, and maybe he gets elected a second term. Who knows, if he were not assassinated. But again, he stands up to the stalwarts, the wing of the Republican Party that was causing a bunch of issues, certainly in New York. And he kind of stands up to them and breaks them up. With Martin Van Buren, obviously, you've got the panic of 1837. If I'm not mistaken, I think there was also a panic of 1839. So you're talking about two financial crises that
Mhm.
he does virtually nothing to stop. Again, as you mentioned, the carrying out of the Indian Removal Act, which was just absolutely devastating. Richard Nixon, I've got just a few spots below you do for all the obvious reasons. Watergate is probably the most infamous presidential scandal in history. And when you talk about all these different things involved with Watergate and the fact that it was so bad that you had members of his party, one of the members actually being future President George Bush. Basically, they were telling him, "Hey, you don't have a choice. You've got to get out of here. You got to resign, or you're going to be removed. After you're impeached." And just the sort of shameful exit of office, I think, is unlike anything we've ever seen from a president. So that's why I've gone at 32. 31 with Arthur. There are some good things there. Obviously, he, similar to Benjamin Harrison, like you mentioned, there were some advancements that he made to the Navy that actually would come back to really help the United States in the Spanish-American War. But coming off of Garfield's assassination, there's not, as you mentioned with how you rank your list, there's not a lot of public confidence in Arthur.
Mhm.
The fact that this guy was pretty much kicked out of his job. If I'm not mistaken, wasn't he the chief collector of the Port of New York?
Yep.
And Rutherford B. Hayes kind of just removes him from that spot, and the fact that literally 3 years later he's president of the United States is something that kind of makes a lot of Americans feel a little uneasy. The fact that he was sort of the product of this corrupt political machine. Grover Cleveland at 30, obviously the only president to be elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. Again, you've got a number of crises, the financial one, especially in his second term. And he doesn't do much to really stop it. So that's kind of my thing with Cleveland. And it wasn't a matter of him being like unsympathetic, but it was a matter he didn't work horribly well with the Republicans. And again, he didn't do anything to really exude any sort of public confidence. So that's
Mhm.
why I've got Grover Cleveland at 30th. And then finally, I've got Gerald Ford at 29th. I have to put him above Nixon because the one thing I'll give Gerald Ford, and obviously the pullout of Vietnam was really bad. And there's a lot of controversy surrounding his pardoning of Nixon that people still debate to this day. But the thing with Ford that I give him a lot of credit for is that in a time that was just it was a political mess, everybody's talking about Watergate. he did a really good job, I think, in the what is it, 2.5 years he was in office, of sort of slowly, very slowly, but getting the country sort of out of that shock factor of Watergate and into the future,
Mhm.
to where, once Jimmy Carter comes in office, even for his issues, nobody's really even talking about Watergate at that point. So I do think Gerald Ford deserves a lot of credit for that, and I think it goes to his character, which has been always been commended. So yeah, what's your thoughts on where I've got these guys?
I think that's a very fair ranking. I think honestly, um, I'll explain why I put specifically Arthur and Ford a little bit higher on my list once we get there.
Mhm.
Um, Your argument for Harding, though, I think was actually really good. When I put into my ranking for him, what I thought a lot about was just that at the time, he was very popular. He kind of revolutionized campaigning in a lot of ways, um, and he was very popular even through Teapot Dome. But it wasn't until after his death that people turned on him, um, and I think that maybe I was too fair to him in my ranking.
Yeah.
But I guess it's too late to make those edits now. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, and that's like I said, like you mentioned earlier, there's plenty of different prisms that you could look through in terms of ranking presidents. So, and again, like I mentioned, he's I've seen lists many lists where he's like in the bottom five. So,
Mhm. I think that's too far. I don't think
yeah,
this sounds like even if you put him in the group of like they didn't really get a lot done, I don't think that he's like that bad.
right, right, right. No, but like the rest of the list start and then go on to
Mhm.
to Taylor on.
Yeah, I think obviously we agree on Garfield and Van Buren. I think you make a good argument for Taylor. I just think that I'm just not sure there wasn't enough substance to his presidency for me to
Okay.
put him um like this high, but I understand the argument. Nixon is totally fair. Like I said, I kind of had trouble on where I wanted to put him. um Arthur, I think, is a totally fair argument. Um I'm an optimist, so I was a little sympathetic towards him. But there are some redemptive qualities that I see in him that I'll talk to when
Sure.
I get there. Um, Cleveland, I think, is fair. I think one of the hardest things for me was just that again he was really popular despite a lot of his scandals and things, which is interesting, um,
Right. No, no
to say the
question.
least. And then Ford, I think, is really fair. I would probably say the reason why he got a pretty decent ranking for me, he's a few spots up, which we'll see in a minute. So not like
Yeah.
terribly different. Ford for me, it's the same reasons, but from a little bit of a different prism. It's just that I think for that extraordinary circumstance he was in, someone who was by all means not really prepared or expecting to become president, kind of thrust into this job kind of in the last minute. He, I think, really did step up, even though it was a very turbulent administration, and was able to provide confidence to the public and move us past Watergate. And I think that I would say the way that people had moved on from Watergate by the time of Carter, I think, that's only like 2 years. Ford, I think, deserves a lot of the credit for that.
Oh, there's no question. And Ford's of the presidents that did come into this sort of those tough situations, most of them coming off of a president's death. In his case, a resignation, which is, I
Hmm.
mean, what could argue even more chaotic.
And
And
especially for being, he had only been vice president for a couple months at that point.
right, exactly, because he was the only man to ever be vice president and president without being elected to either
Hmm.
position, which is just crazy to think about.
Yes.
And so I admire again for he was a very a decent man. Everybody
Mhm.
on both sides really liked Gerald Ford, and
And
so
and again, he's only like two spots on
yeah.
mine above where you put him, so not terribly different.
Right, and again, he's obviously there was some stuff again, like I mentioned with Vietnam and with the party of Nixon, but I think overall, like I said, he did a good job of sort of transitioning America out of the shock of Watergate into whatever's going to come in the future. So I definitely have a lot of admiration for him, and who knows? Maybe if he had been elected his own term, he could have gotten more stuff done. I mean, obviously, he
Hmm.
runs against Jimmy Carter in 1976, and Carter doesn't like smoke him
Yeah,
in the
and
race.
and
So
I think even just that says a lot too, that as the Republican candidate, that they were even able to like that he was a viable candidate, so close coming out of such a big scandal. I think that that's really notable. it shows that there was like legitimate progress in winning back some of the public's trust.
No question about it. And winning back the public's trust, a great point, because at that point, like, nobody had trust in government because of all the different scandals, not just with
Hmm.
Nixon, but with other individuals. So again, we've gotten through, that's 16 presidents for the two of us. And so we're sort of now transitioning into the slightly above mediocre, but still not. No one's ever going to mistake them for being, no one's ever going to put them in the realm of presidential greatness by any stretch of the
Hmm.
imagination. So we'll we'll go back to your list. This is number 21 through 28. So let's look at Isaac's list right now. And so in order from 21 to 28, he's got John Adams, Lyndon Johnson, Warren Harding, William Howard Taft, Grover Cleveland, Andrew Jackson, Gerald Ford, and Chester Arthur. So from Arthur on to Adams, explain why you ranked them where you did.
Yeah, especially Ford and Arthur aren't super far off where you would have them on your list.
Right.
Um, for Arthur, I'll just say like ditto to all the problems with him that you pointed out. I would also add on. I can't remember if you mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act. He was
Yeah.
the president that signed that into law, although it was under a lot of political pressure. He didn't necessarily like personally support it. Um, so I think that those are all things that are weighing him down a lot. But I think the fact that, and I think that overall, as it goes to vice presidential, um, succession to the presidency, as that goes, he's definitely not one of the best case scenarios that we've had.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that he did turn around on specifically civil service reform and get a lot of work done in that sphere, I think is really important. And I think he should be commended for that because he really finished the work that Garfield had started and hoped to get done while he was in office. And that was one thing that Arthur did do and did complete, even though he was someone who his entire political career had been because he was part of that system. So that way he was able to turn it around despite the backlash that he was going to face for it. I think, I think I give him some points for that. Ford, again, I have to say ditto a little bit. He and I feel like we did a pretty good discussion of him there. But again, it's just for the most part, policy wise, very mediocre presidency. His handling of the end of Watergate, I think, can really easily be criticized. I don't think that I understood why he handled it the way that he did. Um, but I think we could have done a lot more, and I think we probably should have. Um, but I think that the way that he was able to win back the public's trust is the most notable thing of his administration. Um, for Andrew Jackson, I think the low spot um, is this kind of middle spot I think is understandable. He has a bad track record on race. No one can really argue
Right.
about that. He was also very violent. He was difficult to get along and to work with. That said, despite a lot of his personal problems, which we highlighted a lot in our episode, um, I think some of the things that he did, the changes with the national bank were huge for American government, and I think the changes, the most important idea, the idea that everyone, and I'm using air quotes here, you can't see, and at the time everyone was, and it is very notable to say, just white men, that all white men should be able to vote and not just landowners,
Mm-hmm.
was an idea that was really necessary, I think, to get to the point that we are today in America, where we emphasize voting so much and where we have such an importance in making sure that everyone can vote. I think that idea started here, and I think it starts with Jackson, even though he definitely is not your who you want to be the poster child of a voting rights movement, if that makes
Right.
sense,
Right.
because
Right.
he has a lot of issues there. So that kind of duality of Jackson is why he gets this very kind of like in the middle spot. Um, Cleveland, he has a lot of personal scandal, but he was well loved by the public while he was in office, and I think that's the biggest thing why I put him here is I don't feel like there's nothing that really came to mind that was notable that was like really really bad that he did. There's some like questionable things, but nothing that's like truly awful. Um, like long term. I think there are issues that he didn't really address. But again, for me, his was mostly just because people liked him.
Yeah.
uh, Taft is low because um, he becomes fairly unpopular. You see, and a lot of this is on Teddy Roosevelt, but you see
Yes.
the splitting of the Republican Party. Um, you don't, even though Roosevelt wants another term anyway, you do see Roosevelt's run highlights that there is a lack of confidence in Taft the longer he's in office. Along with the fact that he didn't really want this job. I'm sympathetic to him as a person, but I think his presidency was definitely mediocre. Nothing really to write home about. I think his biggest plus that he gets is that he continued some of Roosevelt's work in desegregating parts of the federal government, which was done very quietly, but was a significant move at the time. Harding, I probably put too high. He should probably be. If I were to be more fair now that I'm thinking about it, I would probably put him um, in Cleveland's spot and move Cleveland and Taft both up one.
Okay.
Um, Harding's didn't live long enough, I think, to really make like a massive impact on the office. The changes that he made to presidential campaigning, just by his example, are really notable. The presidential train tour and the idea that the president is going to like go out and visit different parts of the country really originates with him. The way that he did it, and I think that's really notable. It changed the presidency, and he was really well liked while he was in office. I think a lot of the ways his style of communication, I think. Kind of set an example towards the way that we expect presidents to communicate today, although I don't think people realize that at the time. His personal failings, I think, definitely um, hold him down quite a bit. And I think the Teapot Dome scandal, especially, also um, pulls him down. Lyndon Johnson was difficult for me because there's a lot of duality here. I think you see the Great Society, which in some ways can really be commended, in other ways it caused other issues that I think can be criticized. He signed the Civil Rights Act, which is obviously a huge win, but you also have like the start of Vietnam. You see a lot of public unrest while he's president. There's also the fact that despite the fact that he was advocating for some pretty progressive social policies, behind the scenes and to members of his administration and White House staff, he was pretty racist and did not treat them well. And I
Right.
think that mix of what I think is fair to say was a bad leadership style with some good policies kind of earns him this middle of the road spot. John Adams is here. This is probably Adams might be my most controversial ranking, um, because he winds up normally in the higher end, like a lot of the early presidents do. Um, my biggest problem with Adams is that he should have known better for some of the mistakes that he made because he's really, really smart. He was a really,
Yeah,
really
oh,
smart guy.
absolutely.
And I think, especially when it comes to, the limiting of the First Amendment while he's president, I think that I just can't forgive him for that because he definitely knew better.
Right.
He was there as they debated and discussed these ideas. Um, so I think, and the fact that like he first became prominent in the Americas for a court case where he was defending the Redcoats, which was essentially in a lot of ways highlighting the importance of issues that we see in the First Amendment, was kind of what he was arguing for there. In his right to represent them and to be protected and advocating for them, even though he disagreed with them. That's and just for that, he gets a low spot on my list. That and also the fact that he definitely had a lot of low public confidence, wasn't popular. Second president, but also the first one voted out of office. So,
Yeah. No, yeah, you make a great case on him, and I think I think you're actually gonna be a little surprised where I've got Adams on my list once we get to
ooh,
the next slide. Yeah, I mean, you make some great points for obviously Arthur and Ford. I mean, Jackson's a tough one in terms of like, do you put him around like the low teens to mid to low 20s? Like, it's
mhm,
really there's some good there, and then there's like,
mhm.
man, this guy's out of his mind.
Because there's a lot of reasons why he was revered as like a great president for a long time,
Yeah,
which I don't think he deserves that high praise considering his issues, but there are reasons there. It's not like he was always completely terrible and we were just trying to make him good. There
yeah.
there are massive problems there, but there are reasons why he is remembered, and that's what makes him so difficult.
And I never really thought about the perspective of, in his own certainly very flawed way, um sort of the perspective of, as you said, everyone in air quotes, because obviously he had a very checkered history on race,
Mm,
but sort of like everybody can and should be able to vote.
mm,
And so that's I've never really heard that sort of perspective before. I think it's really interesting.
mm,
With Grover Cleveland, that's an interesting one too, because he was obviously popular, certainly in his first term. I would
mm,
argue, though, with Cleveland, and the reason I had him lower than you did, and I think you can make a case for somebody like a John F. Kennedy in some ways. I think sort of the image of Cleveland's family, I swear to you, I think helped him a little bit with the first lady,
uh,
with in his second term, his daughter. Um, I think you can make the case that maybe that not necessarily public confidence in some ways, but they're like, hey, we kind of like this guy.
mm,
And to a certain degree, obviously, the one thing that's fairly commendable about him is when they found out when he was running for his first term in 1884 that he had an illegitimate child, and he flat out confessed it,
mm,
confessed to doing that. So, and that I think maybe you could say that sort of helped him along the way in both of his terms. That the public seemed to no one necessarily hated Cleveland, right? So
mm.
you could certainly make that case. Um, to William Howard Taft, yeah, you make a good case there. Obviously, 24th seems like a good spot. It was a fairly mediocre presidency. I mean, look, there was a reason that a third party candidate, albeit Teddy Roosevelt, but a third party candidate, finished higher than he did in 1912. And like you said, he didn't want the
There,
job.
there's also a reason that William Howard Taft wanted to be remembered as a Chief Justice of the Court and not as a president.
Right. Right. No, you're absolutely right. And like you said, you've expressed your regrets about your Harding ranking, but I mean, like I said, when we talked about it, when we talked about Harding, there were certainly some accomplishments. I
Mm,
believe the economy was in a really good spot at that point. Obviously, this is pre-depression when he was president, so there's some stuff there, but yeah, I think this is probably, well, this and another president, if that we'll get to later, probably our biggest gap in how he ranked that. I think I had him at 36, you did 23, so maybe
mm.
we like sort of come some sort of compromise in the middle, like 29-30 seems like maybe it's a good spot for Harding. Lyndon Johnson's interesting. He's a hard one, man, because you obviously have as you mentioned, the Great Society. There's some good and bad with that. The Civil Rights Act, we talked about with the lower presidents, the awful pieces
Mhm.
of legislation they signed. Civil Rights Act is one of the greatest.
And that
Um,
and the sense of the Civil Rights Act for me, honestly, was really what was pulling him up. I
yeah,
really wanted to give him a lower ranking, but I was like, I can't because that was just so important, you know.
right. Yeah, and then sort of the first year and a half of him being president, around like 1965, 66, and then Vietnam comes around and he's just hated around the country. You've got obviously you got the protest in Washington. You've got, I mean, everybody is just really excited for, I mean, he didn't even run for a second term of his own because the
Uh,
Democratic Party is like, we don't think we can win with you running in 1968. So
mhm.
yeah, it's certainly a promising start once he comes in office, but a really really rocky end. And then for John Adams at 21, look, I think you make a good case. The Alien and Sedition Act is about as direct a direct attack on the First Amendment as you could possibly have, because he was, as you mentioned, he was very smart. He knew that this was an attack on the First Amendment, but not the issue was not his intelligence; it was his confidence, and he was extremely thin-skinned, as we talked about in the first episode. Any sort of criticism just really bothered him. So I think it's a very fair ranking of John Adams, in my opinion. So um, yeah, I mean, I think you make a good case for all eight of these, number 21 to 28. If you have any last thoughts before I move on to mine, feel free.
I think this one, and I think when we move up to like the next group in our ranking, I think though these are like, at least for me, were some of the hardest ones to place, because even like once we get up to like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there are some that are tricky there, but like I feel like generally everyone can kind of agree on at least a few of them, and these are difficult just because these are the ones that are most like they're in the middle, and it's like, oh, like there's so many reasons I can see to like pull them down or bring them up. Um, so like I feel like at least for me, there's like a little bit of fluidity in these.
Hmm.
But this was like my hardest section to do. I don't know if you relate to that
Oh,
or not.
I switched them constantly when I did mine.
Uh,
And so yeah, I think you make great cases for these. Going to to my rankings now. So from number 21 to 28, I've got in this order. I've got John Adams, William Howard Taft, Jimmy Carter, George W. Bush, John
Hmm.
Quincy Adams, William Henry Harrison, Rutherford B. Hayes, and Woodrow Wilson. I probably, on second thought, you had your regrets about Warren G. Harding. I probably have Hayes and Wilson too high now that I look
Uh-huh.
at it. But yeah, I mean, there's it's certainly there's plenty of flaws in their leadership that you could critique, and that would be a very fair critique. With obviously you got with Benjamin Harrison, you have again nothing awful happens in
Hmm.
office. There were some economic struggles at that time that kind of hurt his popularity among the American people. So
Hmm.
that's why again,
But
he's yeah.
sometimes being forgettable is the best thing you can be. You know what I mean?
Hey,
There's not that, like you said, there's nothing really. There's nothing like huge dragging him down, and that's why, like, I don't think this is necessarily an unfair ranking of him. It's just he's hard to place because there isn't really anything like super notable about his presidency.
no, there's not. And the thing with him as well is that you have somebody who's again sort of difficult to get along with, and that's why some of the goals he had in office were ultimately not realized. He didn't do the greatest job. I think they called him the human icicle when he was president because he was just kind of so hard to reach. John Quincy Adams at 25, man. John Quincy Adams is a guy like I genuinely like the guy because you look at some of his policies and some of the ideas that he wanted to get done. But his issue was he was his father's son. He was completely unwilling to compromise with anybody, and he was like his father was very thin skinned, and so because of this, and in some ways, the reason I have him as high as I do at 25, and he's sort of in that middle, sort of mediocre spot, is because there's I believe he had he there was a lot in Congress that like from the get-go because of how the Jackson situation in 1824 played out, like we're just they were basically saying we refuse to work with this guy because
Mm-hmm.
we believe Andrew Jackson was kind of screwed over in the corrupt bargain.
Mm-hmm. Uh, JQA is really hard to rank, and I'll elaborate more on my feelings on him when we get to my placement of him. He's hard because not on everything, but on a lot of the issues, I think in the long term he was proven right, and
Hmm.
I think that's what made it hard for me. Is I was like the things that he was trying to do like is ultimately on a lot of things is where we went, you know. But so he was definitely like forward thinking in that sense. And was a great legislator and things like that. But he just didn't, like you said, didn't have that support at all while president. And there's a reason why he got Jackson wiped to the floor with him. At the end of his
Yeah,
term.
yeah, because sort of there was this in 1828. There was kind of a okay, let's make sure that our guy wins this time, so that this doesn't go to I believe it went to the House of Representatives who
Uh,
picked the winner in 1824. They're like, man, let's and that 1828 campaign was just a mess because I don't remember reading much about any policy that either man was proposing. It was just a constant attacks
yeah.
on the other, and so it was just it was kind of a meh with John Quincy Adams where I've got him. George W. Bush. Yeah, again, Bush and Carter, I feel like it's fitting that I put them in the spots that I did and for, sort of both are good guys. I mean,
Uh,
I like Jimmy Carter and George W. Bush both. I mean, you guys can see for the YouTube audience, I've literally got George W. Bush his book over my shoulder along with Barack
mm,
Obama's. But the thing with Bush that it's hard to move past. And again, he's got in my view, he's got a spot locked in the top half because of how he handled the events of 9/11. Like I don't think
mm,
there's any question you can, of course, like top half, he's at 24, so he's right at the middle. But I think you could make the case he is going to rise in the rankings as time passes. But I think his ultimate issue was you obviously have the Iraq War and how
mm,
that turned out, and one could say, hey, that's not fair to him. It was the intelligence, which is absolutely fair thing to say. I think the handling of Katrina could have been better, not just on his part, but of the federal government in general. And obviously, you had the recession of 2008, which kind of sank his popularity for a few years after he left office. But sort of the thing that elevates him in my view is how he handled 9/11. It's about as well as a president could handle a crisis. Jimmy Carter, again, something else is he too has a crisis that has its many highs and lows. With the hostages.
Uh,
Um, Again, he tries to negotiate for their release. He said himself that he did not want to bomb that area because he didn't want to put the hostages at risk. But I guess the biggest thing for him, the biggest low point is the economic issues of the day. Gas prices were through the roof. It was, and he did a bad job. But we played the Malay speech a couple
mhm,
episodes ago, and it was sort of it felt like a talking to from the president more than it
mhm.
did, we're going to get through this kind of thing.
And when it's at a time when they're like, they're talking about like trying to reserve your water and your energy and like your like electricity and like everything basically, because we're at such a poor economic standpoint, you know, that kind of talking to is not inspiring confidence to the
Right.
public. And I think that for me with Carter, that's really what hurt me was I think I think Carter's somebody who basically always has good intentions, like
Yeah.
great person. I just think he just didn't connect with the public as president in the way that he wanted to, and I think that's really, I think I could have given him a more sympathetic ranking if he was able to inspire some public confidence throughout the difficulties, and he just wasn't able to.
Right.
Bush, I think your points are totally fair. I'm gonna wait and talk about why I put him where I put him when we get there.
Yeah.
But we're actually saying similar things, or from like a slightly different viewpoint.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, no, I mean you make a good case, and what elevates Carter, in my view, Bush handles 9/11 well, and I could argue maybe I should switch Bush and Carter. I mean, sort of on second look, but the thing with Jimmy Carter is you have obviously the negotiations between I believe it was Egypt and Israel, or was it?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it was Israel and Egypt, and two countries that have been fighting since biblical times, and nobody knew this better than Jimmy Carter, who is kind of a Bible historian himself. And so he sort of took this to heart and said, you two are not going to leave Camp David until we get a deal done. So I think he does deserve credit there as sort of like a
Mhm.
peacemaker. In terms of foreign policy, he wasn't. He'd probably be in the upper half of presidents, but domestically, there were too many issues for him to put him, in the top 20. William
Yeah,
Howard Taft, I have him at 22 because a lot of the policies that were successful under Teddy Roosevelt, his predecessor, he continued them.
yeah.
I think a lot of the issues was with him were that again, not necessarily a great job of getting out the message. Obviously, a very different president, a very different man from Teddy Roosevelt, and obviously the attacks by Roosevelt, I do think hurt his popularity in some ways. So that's why I
Mhm.
sort of gave him a sympathetic ranking. And John Adams, I've got him exactly where you have him. I got him at 21 because it's just hard to it's hard to look past the Alien and Sedition Act. The one thing that I will give him obviously is the advancements to the Navy that he did make.
Mhm.
I mean, we had, I forgot what the number was when we did the episode, but it was a very small amount of ships, especially compared to the mighty British military. And he did make advancements there in terms of the volume of ships and obviously the
Mhm.
number, the weapons, that he added. So yeah, from 21 to 28, what's sort of your reaction to my list there?
I think that it's a really fair ranking. Like, I don't think there are any of these that I can really like. Like, I didn't put all of them in the same spots, obviously, but I think like for the things that you're focusing on here and the way that you've explained it, like I can't. There's nothing that I can really argue against here. I think that it's definitely fair. I'm glad that we both have the same thoughts on Adams because I've met one or two uh, John Adams fans in my life, and hopefully not many more. Just kidding, just kidding. But but yeah, Taft I think was the hardest for me on this section because I agree with you. I kind of feel for him, but it's just he's difficult to place.
Mhm.
Because I think like you mentioned, that his policies weren't necessarily bad, but for me, when I looked at that, I was like, well, a lot of these, in the same way that you said he kept the ones from the Roosevelt administration. For me, I had a little bit of problem of, okay, well, how much credit does he have for just keeping them in place if they're already there?
That's a good
And that
point.
was difficult because we saw this sounds odd. We saw to some extent some of the flaws of Woodrow Wilson, or that he didn't keep some of those same policies in place.
Right.
So
Yeah,
that's
no, that's a totally fair argument. I think that's a great perspective to look at is are we going to give you a ton of credit for doing your job?
Mm.
Like that's a very fair point. I think that's good on your part.
So I think that's always the tricky thing with some of them, and like I said, this kind of middle section is just one of the harder ones because there's a lot, like even like with what you were saying with Bush, or even kind of the way that both of us placed Carter in slightly different spots. Mine a little bit lower and yours a little bit higher. These are the ones that I think are hardest because they are kind of in the middle. Like there's good arguments for both sides. And that's why for me this was probably the most difficult section.
Oh, there's no question. I mean, because this is the section where you've had the most presidents rise and fall.
Mm,
I think. I mean, I feel like if you look at a lot of the lists since, for example, and there's a lot of presidents where this is the case, but if you look at some of the lists from say 2, 3, 4 years after George W. Bush leaves office, he's like in the bottom 15.
mm.
And
And that's
so,
definitely just like not fair. Like
right, right.
I was like, love or hate George W. Bush, he definitely isn't one of the worst presidents we've ever had.
Yeah, yeah.
Like I think it's a step too far to put him in like top 10 or something, but like, you know, definitely not the worst.
Right. Yeah. And so some of that is because of, I guess maybe we always, it's all, it's sort of like we talk about with movies. What really makes a great movie is the first 15 minutes and the last 15 minutes. I think a lot of it might have been, on the some part by a lot of Americans, historians specifically, maybe the recency bias of the recession of 2008.
Mm,
Maybe didn't put him in a horribly favorable spot, but that I feel like he has been rising in the list since he left in 2009. So 24, he very easily could rise from around that sort of middle area presidents. And again, like John Quincy Adams, I'm more of a fan of than John Adams because of some of the differences there. But again, their presidencies are quite similar actually
mm.
when you look at them. But John Adams certainly got more done in office, but in terms of their leadership style, it was almost identical. But I think the thing you could say in favor of John Quincy Adams is basically all of Congress was against him, which
Yeah.
wasn't necessarily the case always with John Adams. So John Adams is the lowest ranked founding father to be president that both of us have. So, but yeah, I guess it is good to know that we agree on number 21. So now we're coming to the top 20 now. And these are really the presidents that I think for the most part are going to remain in that spot. Maybe they'll rise and fall, gradually, but we, of course, that maybe that's not the case. Again, I gave the example of Woodrow Wilson. You gave the example of Andrew Jackson, how they
Mm.
can, it sort of fluctuates a little bit, but we're starting to kind of come into an area where they're more secure in their spots.
Yeah.
So let's move to, yeah, there it is, to your list. This is number 13 to 20. So we're really starting to get towards the top now. In order, you've got from 13 to 20, you've got Harry S. Truman, James Monroe, Bill Clinton, John Quincy Adams, George W. Bush, President Grant, Barack Obama, and John F. Kennedy. That's I know you weren't a Kennedy fan. I didn't know you were not this much of a John F. Kennedy fan. Like, I don't know about 20, man, but I do want to hear your explanation for from Kennedy all the way to Truman.
Kennedy is this might be who did I say was my most controversial?
Adams.
Maybe it's Kennedy.
Yes, it
Uh,
is Kennedy. I promise you. I'm not like a Kennedy like super fan or anything,
there
but
are even
like,
even
man,
after I said that, there were a few that I thought of where I was like, this might
right,
people might think I'm crazy for this one, but Kennedy is a little bit lower on mine. He's still in the upper half. He's lower on mine for a couple of reasons. One is because he only had about 2 years in office, um, which hurts him.
right,
And then I think out of those 2 years, there are some good things, but I think like Cuban Missile Crisis is a mixed bag. You know, Bay of Pigs invasion. You've got a number of things there that are some pretty big missteps. I think you also see there is some disorganization in his administration. You also have
right.
the issue of nepotism, which
Mhm.
became like a big political issue while he was in office and after, sadly his assassination, which ultimately resulted in nepotism laws coming into place for the U.S. government. I think that those are the reasons that drag him down for me. Is even though there are things that eventually resulted in huge wins, I think a lot of those were things that he set up, but he didn't get to, he teed up the ball, but didn't get to hit it.
Right.
And I think the one thing though that I think really, maybe I think out of my explanation, which is a little biased, I think the one thing that probably I could have given him a higher spot for is popularity. I think
Right.
without a doubt, probably one of maybe even the most top five most popular presidents we've had. Like
Yeah.
just like from then to now, I think I couldn't make an argument about that. Um,
Sure.
but I think for mine, I think it's more just I think not as much as the other presidents that were at the bottom of the list, but I think he still suffers from, you know, um, having that shortened term because of his assassination, because of his death. I think that hurts his ranking for me. Um, Obama was actually hard. I had a hard time ranking him because I could kind of see arguments either way. I think there are some things that what could be considered his biggest wins could also be considered like his biggest failings. A part of that is
Hmm.
because a lot of them are still divisive political issues. I think,
Yeah.
and I think some other things, like I think the legalization of like same-sex marriage or something, if you want to look at that as a civil rights issue, I don't know how much credit he gets for that because that was a Supreme Court decision. It wasn't really,
Right.
I think those things are, I think there's a mixed bag there. Um, I think just as a policy goes, not necessarily endorsing or not endorsing this, but like the Affordable Care Act was a huge win for his agenda. That was something that, in a lot of ways, seemed like something that couldn't be passed through Congress, and he did get it passed. I think, um, you look even on kind of civil rights and kind of diversity, social issues. He appointed two female and the first Hispanic justice to the Supreme Court. Um, I think generally, and we talked about this in the episode with him, there was a lot of public approval. People really liked him. People felt comfortable with him. I think that those things help him. I think there are other issues too. Like I think we talked about the drone strikes. I can't remember if we talked about the invasion of Libya.
We didn't
I
talk
think
much about the
those.
invasion of Libya. We did talk briefly about the drone strikes. Yes.
Okay. I think those are things that hurt him. I think his
Right.
foreign policy too. I think is a mixed bag. I think there are some
Mhm.
wins. I think there are some strengthening of relationships, good things that definitely happened. I think there are also things, I think that there were missteps taken in specifically Iraq with the pullout of troops, which it was indirectly, but led to the rise of ISIS. I think that, those are all issues that I think make his ranking complicated, but I think definitely upper half. But I think for me, it's this kind of lower upper half section.
Gotcha.
Um, at least for now, I think his legacy is still, like I said, once we get to the more recent ones,
Yeah.
it's a little tricky in placing them. Ulysses S. Grant, I had difficulty with too, because there was a ton of scandal in his administration, which I think drags him down. But I think public confidence was pretty good. I think we saw not perfect handling, but I think we saw pretty good handling of Reconstruction from him. I think he was a good for the first president elected post Civil War. I think we see a lot of building confidence back in the nation. And I think, Grant was probably the best president you could get for that.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, for me, I think that is kind of the biggest thing that lifts him up. Um, the biggest thing that drags him down is the scandals. And that's why I could see like a middle to low ranking for him. But I felt like this um, was more fair because I feel like the long term effects of his presidency, I feel like that kind of being a unifying symbol lasted longer than the perception of the scandals. Um, George W. Bush. So there are things that we actually agree on. That part of the biggest thing for Bush is his reaction to 9/11 and his handling in the aftermath. I think that definitely puts him, like you said, at least on that upper side. Um, I think there are missteps. I think the recession definitely complicates things. I think Katrina, which we talked about quite a bit in that episode, complicates things because that's a really complex issue. His response to both of those are really complex. But I think definitely left some room were a little lacking. Um, at least I think for me, I would say I think the beginning of the Iraq War is definitely questionable, but I would say at that time that he left office, things were going well in Iraq and Afghanistan. The public was definitely
Mm.
tired of them, but as things go, in responding to a crisis like that, we had at that time it looked like we did win the war in Iraq,
Mhm.
and at that time things were looking like they were on the up in Afghanistan, and the troop surge, despite being incredibly controversial, did work in kind of securing our standing in both of those wars. So I think the fact that in those wars there was some follow through, at least during his administration, and the fact that his response to 9/11 was so strong. I think those are the two things. Those extraordinary circumstances bumped him up, but I think the best arguments against him are also the extraordinary circumstances like Katrina and the recession. Um, so I think I completely understand your ranking of Bush, but that's my defense of him.
Right.
Um, JQA is pretty high on mine, maybe too high. I could um, give into that he's probably too high. I think that the reason why I gave him such a high ranking is I think that history has proved him right. I think that looking back on it, I think that probably a second term of JQA would have been a good thing for the country if he was able to establish public support. But his biggest problems were that he didn't have public support and that he didn't really get anything done.
Yeah.
But I think just the fact that he did take a stand and did what he could improve things. But I think simple things just like um, a lot of his work during his administration led to the healing of the relationship, at least a normalization of a relationship between the United States and Great Britain. Even just the idea that roads were like a public commodity, those kind of things. He forwarded a lot of that thought that led to he was on the right track, if that makes sense, for the way the country was moving,
Sure.
in a way that I think, while other leaders like Jackson in some ways were, I think John Quincy Adams had a more equitable future in mind, and I think that he gets points for me for because of that. Bill Clinton, he's another one that I'm like, this is probably controversial. His handling of the economy was overall pretty good. His handling of foreign policy was overall pretty good. Um, there weren't any like massive domestic issues. Even though his response to rising gun violence with like the assault weapons ban was highly controversial. That concept is still highly controversial. It wasn't at that time. Um, it wasn't the same kind of controversy that we would have over that today. I
Right.
think that he did a good job being a consensus builder. I think you look at approval ratings. He had a pretty good approval rating the entire time. The biggest thing that pulls him down are the scandals, and that's why 15 is a difficult spot to put him in because I think um, because the scandal that led to his impeachment definitely results in leadership problems for him, which we talked about in the episode, that it reflects on him as a leader, drags down his legacy. I think it definitely does. I think for him right now, I think it's just that there needs to be more, like, just good, not controversial, or at least as controversial presidents to start bumping him down some spots. I think there's a chance that a couple on these lists, like I said, Bush and Obama were a little difficult because they've been more recent. I could see either of them moving up and him moving down a few spots in the future. But I think for him, it was just that despite that personal controversy, things were pretty like there was high public confidence, and things were for the most part pretty good.
Yeah.
Um, Monroe is up there because for some reason a lot of the founders things were good. No like huge crazy crises while Monroe was president. We're still in that kind of growth stage for the country. Again, I think he probably gets into some of the issues of continuation, like how much credit do they get for continuing somebody else's policies.
Mm.
Um, I think also for Monroe, I think the Monroe Doctrine, despite some of the controversy around it, I think definitely is something that obviously grew out of his presidency, but um, definitely as a landmark for American foreign policy, was a deciding point for a long time in our foreign policy with Europe and with South and Central America. And I think that, that's something that I think, even though there have been some bad things that came from that policy, I think overall it was something that, at least at the time, was positive. Manifest Destiny, which was also pretty big while he was president, is controversial because it goes back and forth. That ties into Polk too, but I think the way that he handled it was arguably better than a Polk, because he did not have as militant of a stance, which I think was good. Well, when it comes to just like, you know, not not leading to people dying, not leading to
Right. That's
hurting the
usually a good thing,
natives.
Isaac.
Yes, yes. So I think that's kind of my argument for Monroe. Truman, I felt a little torn about too, because I think you could make a good argument that Truman was not the greatest president. But I think for somebody being thrown into office after being vice president for like hardly any time at all, I'm trying to think of the exact
It
number.
was about a month.
Yeah, about a month. New to the administration, didn't know what was going on. To be able to lead the end of the Second World War, probably the greatest, at least one, I don't know if I'd say the greatest, one of the greatest crises that America has ever been in. Even though the dropping of both of the atomic bombs was extremely controversial, I think, depending on either way you look at that, I think there's a lot to commend about the way that he carried the nation through that. And I think one of the biggest things for him is the Marshall Plan. I think that he handled that extremely well. And I think that he gets points for that. So that's my defense of my 13 through 20.
Yeah, I think you make great cases for all of them. I'll sort of start. I usually start with the last one you got ranked and go the first. I'll go first to the last.
Okay.
Truman. I mean, I think you make a great case, and what Truman deserves credit for, especially with the Marshall Plan,
Mm-hmm.
which to me is as great as or I should say great, as smooth of a job as he did transitioning to the presidency after the death of FDR. He deserves immense amount of credit for that, but I think there's no question the Marshall Plan is the high point of his time
Mm-hmm.
in office, as well as desegregating the military.
Yes.
But I think that with the Marshall Plan, what it sort of simplified is that, when sort of, for lack of a better term, when the fit hits the shan, America's going to be, there for the countries that, are going through a really tough
Mm-hmm.
rebuilding process. And I think that was good for
Mm-hmm.
Truman's legacy. And I think
I
it was, yeah.
I think to add two things off of that onto for Truman, I think one, that, like you said, that America was going to kind of be there for them. I think also the establishment of the United Nations,
Mm.
which is arguably an imperfect system, but I think you definitely see this idea of a little bit more of a we're all in this together sort of thing. And I think that this is the America as a global leader, I think, is cemented during Truman's time in office, I think, because of his policies.
That's a good point. And with James Monroe, yeah, 14 seems like a solid spot for him. Obviously, um, excuse me, you do have some controversial policies in there in terms of how he handles, again, the early issue of slavery, and a lot of the decision that he did make would sort of years and decades and decades down the road would sort of lead to the Civil War. So that's
Mhm.
sort of a knock on Monroe. But I think what he deserves credit for, obviously, you talked about, the Monroe Doctrine has been used by a number of presidents. You think about
Mhm.
Teddy Roosevelt, a guy you have on this list, John F. Kennedy. A lot of these presidents have used that.
I think I
Again,
think Monroe
yeah,
is like the least controversial of like the kind of like founding era presidents.
yeah.
I think, and I think that's why, and sometimes I felt like it was a little tricky to place him, because I don't feel like he was on that more mediocre side, but there also isn't as much substance to his presidency as there is to a lot of the people around him.
Oh, for sure. And obviously, uh, Monroe is, you have, at this point, you have the era of good feelings,
Uh,
and there was just a general, people tended to like James Monroe, right? Like he wasn't necessarily
mhm,
he was similar to Washington in some ways, in that he obviously he wasn't like the leader Washington was, but he was, maybe not necessarily the smartest guy in the room, But there was a good, again, we talk about this over and over, a good public confidence in him by the people, and that was reflected directly in the years that he was elected. Like, it wasn't even close. And so that's, Monroe deserves credit there. Bill Clinton at 15, that feels like a solid spot for him. And like you mentioned, with the scandal that got him impeached in 1999, that's certainly something that could possibly, as the years go on, cause him to fall in the rankings. But again, as you mentioned, it was I believe it was the first time since Andrew Jackson that we had balanced the budget.
Uh-huh.
And so, he is handling that. And like you said, sort of, I think the high point of Clinton's presidency is that he was a really good, he did a good job of sort of compromising with other Republicans,
Mm.
and sort of being sort of that bridge between the two parties. Certainly with he and the former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. John Quincy Adams at 16. Yeah, I mean, that I think it's a touch high, but I think with him, look, you do have, as you mentioned, that's a good case in terms of his ideas later on were probably proven correctly, and certainly his career. We talk about John Tyler's post presidency probably lowers him in a lot of lists. You could argue John Quincy Adams post presidency lifts him
Mm.
because of his
I,
work in Congress.
I feel like John Quincy Adams is like right person, wrong time, sort of.
That's yes, yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and George W. Bush, again, you make great points about him as well. And again, the thing, the troubling thing with Bush that I had
Mm.
was the issues in office were not always directed straight to the president, as it is
Yeah.
with others. And again, like you said, his handling of 9/11 was, I think, phenomenal. Going to Ulysses S. Grant, this is another tough one because, like you said, there are a ton of presidential scandals. There's a ton of scandals in his 8 years in office.
Mm.
You obviously have, though, of the three presidents that dealt with Reconstruction, being Johnson, Grant, and Hayes, I think Grant handles it the best. Obviously, part of that is because he's in there for the longest.
Hmm. It's
Johnson and
also
Hayes for
sad to
more
say
terms.
that that's also not like being the best president that handled Reconstruction isn't like the highest award ever.
Right, because Reconstruction, it didn't exactly end well. So, like, yeah,
Yes.
that's a good point. Yeah, Obama at 19th, and again, the thing about Obama is that you make a good point on is a lot of the goals that he had set. A lot of them were fulfilled while he was in office for 8 years.
Mhm.
And again, certainly the foreign policy, I think, is what could really sort of be his downfall at points
Mhm.
in the rankings.
And Obama was just very difficult for me because I did look at other rankings to kind of just make sure that I wasn't doing anything like too crazy.
Yeah.
And I saw some that put him really high, like top 10, and I just
Yeah.
don't know. I feel like that's just a touch high for me. Um, but I think that he's definitely, like I said, upper half. But I think his exactly where he's gonna like lie in kind of like general perception. Um, I'm not quite sure where that is yet, but I don't think it's quite as high as I saw from a lot of people.
Yeah, no. I mean, 19 seems like a fair spot for him, and John F. Kennedy. That's probably the most controversial one you've had at this point, or probably will have for the rest of this list. But no, I mean, look, you make the good case because he is only there for 2.5 years, and I don't think there's a question. The biggest knock on him, and you mentioned nepotism. We weren't able to get to that in the episode because there
Mhm.
was Kennedy. There's probably some of it might be just the celebrity of John F. Kennedy, but there's so much to discuss. I mean, we could do a whole podcast on the guy, but
Yes.
when it comes to you talked about nepotism, but I think there's no question the biggest knock on his legacy is the Bay of Pigs, and how that
Mhm.
was sort of carried out, and again, it was a complete disaster. So I mean, like you've said before, I think this is a totally fair list. Yeah, Truman feels like he's in a good spot. Monroe's a little low for me, but that feels okay.
Mhm.
Clinton, Obama, Bush, Grant, that seems about where they would be. Adams, I think, is a touch too high, and Kennedy is a little low.
Mhm.
But you make good cases for all these. But any last thoughts before I move to my 13 through 20?
Um, no, nothing's coming to mind right now.
We
So,
pretty much touched it all. Yeah, you're right. Okay, my list 13 to 20 in order. I went James Madison, Ulysses S. Grant, Barack Obama, William McKinley, George Bush, Calvin Coolidge, Bill Clinton, and Andrew Jackson. Probably had Jackson a touch high at 20th because there is there is, I mean, the good. They could really make do a remake of the movie The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly about Andrew Jackson, because there's a lot of all three.
And like I said when I put him, where I did, he is just really hard to place because
Yeah,
he has such a important but complex presidency.
yeah.
Um, and that's what like um, I think 20 is a fair ranking. I think it's just like for Jackson, the hard thing is it just depends on what area you're looking at because he was in a lot of ways I think one of the most like just policy wise long term one of the most important presidents we've had. I think he reshaped the nation in a lot of ways. But anyway, I'll let you get to explaining your
No,
rankings.
no. I mean, I think you make good points about Andrew Jackson, because certainly we've discussed him in depth today. Yeah, Clinton, I've got a little lower than you, in part because of the scandal of the affair with Monica Lewinsky that got him impeached. But again, he was, the economy under him was certainly successful, and something that I think his State of the Union in 2000 was like the number one thing that he touted, and really the sort of, when we look at his legacy, that's like the biggest
Mm.
good job for him on the list. Calvin Coolidge was a difficult one because I've got like a love hate with Calvin Coolidge. Maybe some of it. What's that?
No, I was laughing because I understand.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, maybe some of it's just his personality. Like he just like wasn't necessarily the most friendly person in the world, but look, he was a very introverted guy. But obviously, you talk about the economy in the short term is a good spot, but obviously the depression comes after. I would make the case that with some of the policies, in part because of the people that he appointed to his cabinet, people who really would not have been affected that much by the depression, sort of obviously unintentionally, in some ways, through Coolidge's policy, led to the Great Depression. And I think because I feel like Hoover gets way too much blame for
Mhm.
causing the Great Depression, because again, the guy's there for 6 months than necessarily Coolidge does, because he was there for about 5.5 years after Harding's death. So, but I do think, certainly some of his sort of, I believe he had some tax cuts while he was in there, which was, very popular. So 18 seemed like a good spot to put him. George Bush the first, George H.W. Bush, is somebody who, again, since his passing a few years ago, he's really gone up in the list, because I can make a case that he's probably like the second or third best one-term president,
Mhm.
because you look at, he's a guy who's dealt with, obviously got the Gulf War, which ends fairly quickly. Again, the decision to get or not to get Saddam Hussein was controversial at the time, and his sort of defense was about that was, that wasn't our goal in this war. So, but I think he was a good president in terms of, he's sort of the good side. Let me back up for a minute. Reagan and Coolidge's economy, because they had very different or very similar ideologies when it came to that, sort of the conservative-minded small government type of deal. They were similar in that they were good in the short term and kind of hurt in the long term. I mean, you could even say this about a Democrat like Bill Clinton. I think Bush is dealt a really tough blow, and people hold the no new taxes thing against him more than they should.
Mhm.
Because, it gets to the point, I believe it was in 91, 92, where he didn't have a choice. He had to raise taxes, which, one could argue kind of like sealed his defeat in 1992 against Bill Clinton. But I think in terms of foreign policy, I think George Bush was an excellent president. William McKinley, I probably have him a little lower than I should, because obviously the Spanish-American War is very successful for the U.S. Probably one of the most successful victories for the U.S. in any war. But the thing with him is, you could argue you talked about John Quincy Adams is right person, wrong time. I could argue the sort of a reverse with William McKinley, where he's right place, right time. You know what I'm saying? So,
Uh-huh.
um, and some could argue maybe he waited a little too long to go in the Spanish-American War, but I think because of his experience in the Civil War, that's sort of what postponed that.
Mhm.
And Barack Obama, 15 seemed like a good spot for him. You got him 19th, I've got him 15th. It's kind of in that same ballpark. Again, for him, I think the biggest accomplishment, or at least the biggest accomplishment that everybody would agree on, is the killing of Osama bin Laden. The
Mhm.
fact that
Yeah.
he was faced with a very difficult decision, and obviously you could talk about with George W. Bush, right? He's got from the intelligence, that there's weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that turned out to be false. Well, what if that had been the case with Barack Obama? Like, that's the decision that he had to make. And obviously we know now he made the right decision, and thankfully we were able to get Osama almost 10 years after the attacks of September 11th. So I think that's really the high point with him. Obviously, you're talking about the airstrikes, and obviously with Libya, those are sort of, and even I would argue to a certain degree, the government shutdown is sort of kind of the marks on his legacy. But I sort of put in that top 20 because, look, like you mentioned with the appointment of the first Hispanic justice at the Supreme Court, I think that's certainly an admirable thing for him. Ulysses S. Grant at 14, have him a touch higher than you do because of how he did handle civil rights and
Mhm.
Reconstruction. And look, as you mentioned, it isn't like you said, being the best president during Reconstruction. We're not exactly giving out trophies for that. But the thing with Grant is, it's sort of like the case you made for George W. Bush, like sort of a right intentions kind of guy.
Yeah.
Obviously, because he comes in after the disastrous administration of Andrew Johnson, and really sort of does a lot of good things. It brings a lot of the Southern states back in the Union fairly successfully, and sort of in the way that I think Lincoln would have wanted to. We obviously, the great Abraham Lincoln speech, "Malice to none and charity for all." I think in some ways Grant sort of mirrored this, in part because obviously he was, he was the general of the Union Army at the end of the Civil War. James Madison at 13th. Again, like you said, the founding fathers are usually ranked pretty high, although you and I had John Adams lower than most. The thing with James Madison is he's faced with a very difficult, you could say maybe like the first real crisis of the country with the War of 1812. In
Mhm.
part because of decisions, even going back to Washington, with sort of, Washington chooses neutrality. Adams kind of ticks France off and England off to a certain degree, or I think he ticked England off and to a certain degree France. And then with Jefferson, you had the Embargo Act. And so Madison is kind of in this really tough position where, the capital gets attacked by the British, and he and his wife and everybody else is forced to flee the White House. But I think in general, after those attacks, he did a really good job of getting America sort of out of that period where we are going back and forth in terms
Mhm.
of the war with France and Great Britain. And so that's sort of the case I make. What's your reaction to 13 through 20?
I think your ranking is very fair. I did notice one thing that I think is funny. We both had a Bush at number 17, just not the
Mm.
same one.
Yeah,
Um,
that's fine.
I think, honestly, a lot of the arguments you made for the ones that are higher up for me, that we're going to get to, are honestly the same arguments. I would just like maybe emphasize them a little bit more.
Sure,
But I
sure.
think that um, definitely, I'd agree. I think, um, all of these I think are really like solid ones. I think, well, like Obama, I said, he was kind of hard to place for me because I could see, I think definitely upper half, but I could kind of see arguments for higher or lower half. Um, I think Jackson, I already said, I could definitely see that. I think he's just difficult in general, just
Yeah.
like in death and in life.
And look, the thing with Andrew Jackson for me is like I had to sort of in some ways put by my personal bias. I mean, Jackson's one of my least favorite presidents, to completely
Mhm.
tell you the truth. Like, he's down there with,
Yeah.
like, like guys like Wilson, but I there are certain accomplishments that I can't completely ignore.
Mhm. I think Clinton, I definitely agree with. Like, I think for me, I had a hard time walking that balance between how does the Lewinsky scandal tie into this. Um, Coolidge, I think is definitely a fair ranking. Um, I was a Coolidge fan for a long time. I go back and forth on him now, which probably influenced why he's a little bit higher on mine.
Right.
And I'll explain some of my reasons why. I think how much
Mhm.
blame he should get for the Great Depression is like difficult.
Yeah, it is.
Um, George H.W. Bush, I think, is definitely fair. I'll explain why I put him higher when we get there, but like completely agree with everything you said. McKinley is the same. I agree with everything you said. I'll elaborate a little bit more why I put him a little bit higher. Grant, I think, is totally fair. He's one, like I said before, is a little bit tricky. And Madison, I'll talk. I feel like for all these, I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. But
Yeah.
um, Madison, um, I think his handling of the War of 1812 is kind of what puts him a little bit higher for me, which seems like in some ways is the same reason why you put him a little bit lower, which I think is fair. I think it depends
Right.
on how you look at it. for me, I think it's just like this is like the first war we've had since the Revolutionary War. I think you're seeing a president that doesn't really have anyone to look back to as like an example of what we're supposed to
Good
do,
point.
and I think handles it well, and I think is able to make the country feel confident at a time where probably they shouldn't feel so confident, if that makes sense. Um, so I would give him a. I think his handling of the war puts him up a little bit higher for me, but none of these are like, at this point, none of these are like super duper far off from where either of us are going to put them. They're going to be relatively within the same general area. So, but yeah, no, I think that's definitely a solid list. Like I couldn't make like any massive arguments that any of them should be like drastically moved, except for maybe Jackson. But I can see both sides of that. So.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Let's see. So you have Madison, McKinley, Bush, and Coolidge and Clinton higher than I do.
Mhm.
I grant Obama and Jackson, and Jackson's really the one I'm starting to really regret right now because, like I said, I don't like him at all. I don't. There really isn't much like there. And so, if we had a time machine to go back to the 1830s, I think there's many who would be on our side on that front. But we sort of shift now. Now we're getting to the top 10. We're boarding out of the teens, going to the top 10, and this is really this is sort of the group of presidents who are, I think, really for the most part solidified, in their spot or around their spot, where it's they're a really good president boarding on a great president, like somebody you can make the argument should be on Mount Rushmore. And so going to your rankings, this is 5 through 12. Now, again, we're going to save the top four for the end. 5 through 12 for Isaac. In order, 5 to 12, he's got Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, James K. Polk, James Madison, William McKinley, George H.W. Bush, and finishing out with Calvin Coolidge. So from Coolidge on to Teddy Roosevelt, explain why you ranked them where you did.
So Calvin Coolidge, I think the reason why he's not in the top 10 for me, I think there's two reasons why he doesn't make it quite that high. One is that I think there's a decent argument that he definitely didn't have the worst like crisis response of any president, but had a fairly mediocre one during a couple natural disasters that happened while he was in office. I think the other thing you could criticize him for is like you did with um, not really foreseeing the Great Depression.
Right.
I think the reason why he's so high for me is I think out of all the presidents, I think he did one thing really well, and I think that is he was probably better and like literally like the office paperwork side of the presidency than any president we've ever had.
Hmm.
Um, Purely on the like side that, and we talked about this some of the episode, that like he made like White House staffers switch which pencils they were buying because he found some that were cheaper. Like he would make them use them down until they were nubs, that sort of thing. Like he was a penny pincher, but it was all driven from ideology. Like he was looking at it and saying, the government, why are we wasting taxpayer money? And I think that like really, I think whichever way you look at it is a really admirable thing to do, and he
Sure.
definitely didn't have to. And I think that is kind of what puts him up there for me. I think, even, and maybe he deserves more blame for the Great Depression than he often gets or got at the time. But, he was definitely the Roaring Twenties. He was the president of the Roaring Twenties, even though his personality was the exact opposite.
Yeah.
But I think in a lot of ways, if we hadn't had the Great Depression, I think he would be considered a more defining president than he is.
Hmm. Yeah, you could definitely make that case. And then what about Bush on from there?
So Bush, I'm going to be honest, I actually almost put his number 10, which I thought
Hmm.
might be a step too far, but I'm going out on a limb right here, and I'm going to say, I think Bush, I think this, somewhere around 10, 11, I think is where he's going to get moved up on kind of historians' rankings as things keep going. I think the biggest thing that hurts him is that he broke the no new taxes
Right.
promise, and that he lost re-election. But I think one of those can actually be flipped on its head a little bit. I think, first of all, I think the Gulf War was a win. I think he handled it really well. I think he explained it to the public really well. I think he was able to gain a lot of confidence in the military that we had lost since Vietnam. Um, I think that his economic handling overall was pretty good. There was nothing too crazy there. Set up a lot of things that Clinton was able to use going forward in his administration to keep the economy going well for about a decade. Um, He also, I think, just as somebody of was of good character, which I think was relayed pretty obviously to the American people.
Right.
He also had, and we discussed this in the episode, his handling of the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the USSR. Um, it has been, especially since his passing, has definitely been re-examined, and I think is something that he handled extremely well and deserves credit for. Um, I think breaking the no new taxes deal is a or promise is a double-edged sword because he did break a promise, which hurts public trust. But I think the reason he broke it was admirable, which is that he thought that it was the right thing to do, if that makes sense, and that he
Yeah.
was going to kind of put politics aside for what he thought was right for the country. And I think for rankings, that is an issue that's a double edged sword. But my personal opinion, I think he's going to move up on these rankings within the next decade or two, and I think this is probably where he's going to settle. Um, that's my prediction. We'll see. We can come back in like 10 years and see if I'm
Yeah. We
right.
should. We should. We should do this in 10 years.
And then William McKinley, a lot of the same reasons you put down. I think this is when we talked about in the Spanish American War. This is when America kind of becomes a world player, even though it's definitely not like a world superpower yet. But I think that he made that a pretty graceful entry, even though it was through a war. I think that his handling of the new colonial possessions, which I think in some ways could be critiqued, I think compared to what some like members of Congress were talking about for the time, I think his handling of that was pretty well. Um, I think overall he's remembered pretty well, although I think the reason why he's not remembered is he's not as like a household name, I think is just because he was overshadowed by the president that came
Yeah.
after him. McKinley didn't have like the biggest personality, but I think um, he had a pretty solid presidency. James Madison is also similar to a lot of the things you said about him. Like I said, I've been talking about yours. I would just emphasize, I think, his handling of the War of 1812 and the fact that afterwards he was able to kind of lead the country in a way that kind of helped solidify some things. He saw what happened with the war and kind of flaws that it pointed out with the new country and was able to help kind of start to amend and fix those flaws, and be able to kind of help unify the country a little bit more. I think we see that in his presidency that the states are starting to become more interconnected than they have been, and I think that he played a role in that. Polk is up here. This one might be controversial too. I'm not sure about if it's controversial with you because obviously he's a little bit higher on your list. Because I don't think have you covered him yet?
I have not covered him yet. So
Okay.
he is obviously we know by now
Mhm.
he is higher on my list, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about him.
For Polk, there are a couple reasons why he's a little bit higher. I think there are some decent arguments that somebody can make against him. For me, first I'll say the arguments against him. I think the biggest one is I think he didn't do a lot to stop kind of the anti-Mexican war rhetoric that led to what was ultimately some racism against Hispanic peoples, which was definitely problematic. I think that could be criticized. I think his handling of Manifest Destiny could be criticized for the way that it impacted Hispanic peoples, but also how it impacted Native Americans. I think that is the biggest thing you can really go after him for. Maybe the start of the Mexican American War, but I think I'm not as I don't know fired up about that. I think the biggest thing for Polk for me is that he from the beginning said these are the things I'm going to do, did all of those things, and then
Yes.
left office. And I think that we talked about this and that he might not be the greatest president we ever had, but he was probably the most successful because he did everything he said he was going to do. And I think that's what gave him this number 8 spot for me is I don't think there has been another president that has done that. Um, and I think that he deserves credit for it. He did it without like pulling a bunch of crazy shenanigans to get what he wants. He was able to sell it. He got it done. And for that, Polk gets a lot of credit. Reagan is number 7. He kind of jumps around this um, like kind of like 6 through 10 spot in a lot of the rankings that I've seen. Um, and I think for me, I went back and forth on him. I think his handling of the negotiations with the Soviet Union overall was good. I think it led to the de-escalation. Even though we talked about how some of that weight, more than we probably give, does lay on Mikhail Gorbachev's shoulders. I think Reagan is a key player there, deserves a lot of credit for that. The economy was pretty good while he's president. He played a role in that, despite having pretty controversial economic policies. First appointment of a female Supreme Court justice. Um, he did some good work within that sphere. I think for me, the thing that I really think nails Reagan down in this top 10 is really his communication style. I think that's him he will forever be remembered for. I think he was a good president overall. Nothing like there are some negative things, but overall pretty good. And I think that communication style really revolutionized the presidency. And I think it's something that, I think for a very, very long time, presidents are going to be compared to him in the way that they handle themselves while on camera.
Right.
FDR is there, maybe a little bit lower than some people put him. But I think for FDR, I think there are a couple of reasons why I didn't put him in the top five. And these are my reasons for that. Japanese internment,
Yes.
which the weight of that bears on his shoulders. That is his to own. The second reason is because, and there is some discussion about this, but his economic policies to get us out of the Great Depression were not as successful as he tried to act like they were, and they did at the beginning worsen the Great Depression at the beginning. And I think that as that goes, I think it's fair to say that if the World War hadn't started and we hadn't been able to start selling munitions to Europe, there's a chance that he could have been another one-term president. But I'm not here. We're not here to get into hypotheticals, so I
Yeah.
won't do that anymore.
Yeah.
But
No, I got
I
you.
think his handling of World War II. Obviously, I think it's hard to fault him there. He did a great job with that. I think maybe you could get into some what ifs, but I think in that kind of situation, can't really fault him for any of those strategies outside of Japanese internment, which ties into that. Um, but I think really for a president that's handling a war that is on a larger scale than even the First World War, I think that just secures him in that spot. I don't think he'll move out of the top 10 anytime soon. Um, Teddy Roosevelt is up there. I think he, while he doesn't have what I think is as great of an accomplishment as like leading the U.S. through a world war or something like that, what I think he does have is he is clearly stuck around in the minds of the American people. I think like that's just because of how big his character was. But I think when it comes to conservation, to the creation of the national park system, that is huge. I think that has really revolutionized the way that America has viewed lands and just the increase in public lands. I think that's massive. I think the desegregation efforts that he had were also massive, huge impact on the country, even though a lot of those were reversed by Wilson. Even things like he had was the first president to have, like a black man sit at his table and eat with him. Like that. That's just symbolically is huge. He's a president that, in a lot of ways, led by example, which is in some ways probably the biggest critique of him is that sometimes he didn't wait for the rest of the government to kind of catch up with him
Yeah.
and to approve what he was doing. But I think there aren't a lot of um, Teddy Roosevelt policies that aren't still issues now, for better or for worse. But I think that's because he was a leader, if that makes sense. And I think that's why
Yes.
I give him number five.
That's a great case you make for all of these guys. Focusing a little bit, sort of piggybacking off of what you're talking about with Teddy Roosevelt.
Uh-huh.
Like you said, he's probably excuse me, one of those presidents that is pushing for a top five spot or is even in a top five spot, like you mentioned, probably the only one that didn't have to deal with like a major crisis, like if as it pertains to like a war. His biggest crisis was the working and living conditions, right? Like so,
Mm-hmm.
like that's something that he truly, genuinely took to heart and like absolutely felt bad for these people and went through every possible measure. I mean, some even beyond the power of president, but to help these
Mm-hmm.
folks with the what was awful living and working conditions. As you mentioned, the national park system is a huge part of his legacy. I mean, he was really he was truly a frontiersman, right? He was an
Mm-hmm.
outdoor type of
There,
guy.
there's a reason he's the only president to have a national park named after him.
That's it. 100%. And FDR, that six, I don't think is too unfair because of the things that you mentioned, like you said, New Deal policies weren't weren't groundbreaking, especially right off the bat in 1933 in solving the Great Depression. And I think in a second term, I remember us talking about this. Like his second term was kind of rocky
Mhm.
with some of the things that happened within his own administration with his policy. Reagan at 7 feels like a good spot for him because obviously you talk about the handling of the USSR and with Mikhail Gorbachev and like you said, some of his economic policies have been criticized, and some of those you could certainly argue have been hurt Bush, his successor in some ways.
Mhm.
James K. Polk at 8, I don't think that's crazy to put him at 8, to be honest with you, because like you mentioned, he literally he laid out his goals. This is what I want to do, and he accomplished every single one in 4 years because he said he was only going to run for one term,
Mhm.
and he accomplished all those.
And it's just like that. Like you think today, like not that it's impossible, but it kind of seems impossible. Like I can, you
Oh
know,
yes,
President Trump was a one-term president. There's not to get into any like too much of current events or anything. There's a lot of speculation that President Biden may not run for another term.
right.
But with both of them, I don't think anyone, if either one of them would coming into office said, and these are the things I'm going to do, and I'm only going to serve one term, and I'm going to get all of them done, like it would seem people would think they were joking because that's that
Yes,
like unrealistic of an idea. And you think during that time when Polk was in office, it wasn't, we have problems with partisanship today, in a way that we haven't seen, I think, in the same way.
right.
But I think this wasn't Polk wasn't president in a time where like everybody got along either. Like you know what I mean? Like it wasn't like everyone was on the same page about what he was doing, but he was able to build consensus, and that I feel like I need to defend him a little bit because I can think of people that would really disagree with us putting him this. Well, I don't know where you put him yet, but even so, us putting
Yeah,
him this high. But I think just like that, I just sold for me putting him in this spot.
sure. Again, I think it's absolutely fair. Madison at 9 feels like a solid spot, like you mentioned, with like you really highlighted his how he handled the War of 1812 and us literally being attacked on our own soil and sort of getting us out of that because again we are a baby country, and something you brought up that I never really thought about, that we think about presidents handling crises in the modern time. There's Madison didn't have somebody to look back to, like
Mm,
Washington, Adams, Jefferson didn't have to handle a war this intense and this threatening to the country, and so he certainly did a great job in handling that. William McKinley feels like a good spot at 10. Sort of the reasons I mentioned, like you highlighted his handling of the Spanish-American War and things of that nature. And I absolutely do agree. William McKinley isn't talked about because of the accomplishments and just even the personality of Teddy Roosevelt, his successor.
mm.
Um,
It's like
go ahead.
people say Teddy Roosevelt was a hard act to follow, but he was also a hard act to like proceed.
Proceed. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And they yeah, like again, Teddy Roosevelt is basically Andrew Jackson, just not crazy, like just
Yes.
crazy
Well, a
energetic.
good crazy.
A good crazy, absolutely, yes, a good crazy, because he had certainly more accomplishments than Jackson. And Bush and Coolidge. That I'm not going to fight you at all on those two rankings because, and like you mentioned, that's a compelling case. Maybe Bush does push the top 10 as the years goes on. I don't think, because again, like James K. Polk, to have served one term and like you said, losing re-election, which Polk did not because he didn't run for re-election,
Mm,
as well as the fact that he did break a campaign promise. But again, like you said, he did it for what he believed to be the right reasons. It was a fairly successful 4 years, with him in office. And then you could sort of make a similar case with Coolidge,
mm,
and how he was. Some might classify him as like like you said, a penny pitcher or a tightwad, but it was for the right reasons. So
mm.
again, I think we are really starting to get into this area where these were presidents with good intentions and they capitalize off of those intentions. And they also, unlike the lower presidents we have ranked, they did a great job of conveying their message.
Yes.
Again, you look at FDR, Reagan, phenomenal job at getting their message to the people. So yeah, I think that's a very fair list on your part. So I'll go to my number 5 through 12 in this order. I've got FDR, Reagan, Kennedy, Eisenhower, Monroe, Truman, Lyndon Johnson, James K. Polk. I'll start with Polk. I've always said he is the greatest president that nobody talks about.
Yes.
And because of the fact that he did accomplish everything that he set out to do while in office. And so, obviously, adding, really pushing the country west in many ways, with the goals that he had. Again, the manifest destiny can be criticized, and that sort of bumped him down a spot. Also, the fact that he did only serve one term, I think does he's of course he did die not long after he left office, but let's just say hypothetically, and again, we're not doing a ton of hypotheticals here, but if he runs for a second term, lives through the second term, what happens beyond that? Because look, he only had goals for a 4-year span, and like you said, partisanship really kind of started around the 1824 election with Adams and Jackson, and sort of has, certainly we see today, has just worsened over time. But Polk does deal with it, and to his credit, he was a great. Here's the thing about Polk. I don't want to be too long winded on him, but the thing with him was, he wasn't like this big personality in any way, shape, or form, but he was a really, really good negotiator. I think we talked about he was very subtle in his suggestions for what should get done. And I think that's something that he deserves credit for. I put Lyndon Johnson 11th. I could probably put him lower because of the handling of Vietnam, and the fact like how his presidency ended. But the reason I put him at 11th is I think the Civil Rights Act is so great a piece of legislation. And look, many have said, many sort of many people who aren't as big of Lyndon Johnson fans as others have said, well, he kind of didn't have a choice. He was like carrying Kennedy's legacy in a lot of ways, because it's assumed Kennedy very much would have signed this into law had he lived. And so I think that, sort of carrying Kennedy's legacy, I think bumps him up a few points because of the things that JFK did want to accomplish. Harry S. Truman at 10th. Again, I think there were some, as the guy I have ranked above him, Eisenhower, would sort of tout in the 1952 election, that there were some scandals within Truman's administration. So that bumps him a few spots for me. But I think the handling of the in terms of helping the European countries after World War II, obviously the bombing of in here, was it Hiroshima?
Yes.
Japan, I believe it was obviously extremely controversial for the damage that it caused. However, it did end the World War. And so, obviously you have that. Again, the desegregation of the military, the fact that he won in what was one of the biggest upsets in election history, in I believe it was 1948. And sort of this attitude that he had, like being this very, even for his age, he was in his 60s, like this very he was filled with a lot of vigor, right? Like he was, in some ways, he was kind of what's the word I'm looking for? A plain spoken. I guess that's the best way to put it. But he held himself accountable. We all know the buck stops here was always on his desk, and that's obviously a saying that's continued to this day. So 10 felt like a good spot for me to put him right in that top 10. James Monroe too is somebody that, his accomplishments in office, I think in some ways are sort of looked over because he is the last of the founding fathers. But again, sort of going back to the accomplishments of Truman and winning in what was such a huge upset, Monroe was somebody, despite his, I don't want to say lack of intelligence, but again, not the smartest person in the room necessarily. The fact that he was able to really convey his message well to the American people in terms of them buying into the era of good feelings. I think that certainly helps his case. Eisenhower today, I probably could have put Eisenhower a couple spots higher. Obviously, how he handled Brown v. the Board of Education and desegregating schools, especially the situation in Arkansas. You talk about the Federal Highway Act, which was again huge. And I think his, obviously we talked about this when we talked about Eisenhower. The farewell address was probably, we talked about, the second most important to George Washington. And so, Eisenhower is certainly someone that I think a lot of Americans admire. And I think, looking at the more modern list, is slowly, I mean, I've seen your rankings beforehand, but he is somebody who is slowly climbing up the list of really the pantheon of great presidents. Kennedy, this is definitely the one we disagree the most on. The reason I put Kennedy at 7th, and there's no question, like, the things that to me hold Kennedy back a lot, like the reservations that I totally get from those who don't have him ranked as high, are A, the Bay of Pigs, and B, that something that's not his fault. He didn't serve long enough to really be considered like a truly great president. The reason I had him up there is I go back to a saying that I heard a great radio host once say, that presidents don't get enough credit for the disasters or the crises that they avoid.
Mm-hmm.
And Kennedy's leadership, I think, in my view, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think really saved America's behind, considering how close that those missiles were located, not just to Florida, but really the entire East Coast. And so his handling of that, and also I will give him points with the Bay of Pigs, not how it was carried out, of course, but how he just really completely said, "Hey, this is completely on me. I'm the commander in chief. I made the decision, and it failed, and that's on me." So I think the accountability, I think also is what adds to his legacy. Ronald Reagan at 6, I have just a spot above you, but again, for the same reasons, how he handled the end of the USSR with Gorbachev. I think, and again, this does have to do with policy, but it is something that Isaac, is something that I admire, is when America is mourning a tragedy such as the Challenger disaster. They look to the president. What does he have to say? Again, I think this is something that could go in a positive direction. George W. Bush's legacy with Reagan, how he handled that, it was phenomenal. And of course, he was known as the great communicator, a very stark contrast from his predecessor, Jimmy Carter, who was not as good at conveying his message. Reagan might have been like one of the 3 or 4 best at doing that. And again, like you mentioned, some of his economic policies have been criticized, but 6 felt like a good spot, just a touch outside of the top 5. But I wouldn't necessarily be mad at somebody if they did put him there. FDR at 5. Again, like you, I have him ranked lower than the other Roosevelts for the simple fact that there are, obviously, we talk about his many accomplishments and how he was directly, indirectly, we could debate getting us out of the Great Depression, and also how he handled World War II. I think how he handles World War II really solidifies him in that sort of top 5, 6 presidents in American history. But again, the Japanese internment camps is certainly the biggest stain in his legacy. And again, the New Deal policies were not, well, frankly, let's put it this way, they were about as successful as Herbert Hoover's in his policies in a lot of ways. So, but I think his leadership during World War II, during D-Day and everything after that, and obviously Truman puts the United Nations in place, but that was Roosevelt's idea. And so all that, how he worked with the Allies, he was very hesitant to go into the war, but of course Pearl Harbor happens and we have no choice. And this very sort of comforting leadership that he had, not just through that, but his whole presidency with the fireside chats, I think is admirable. While Roosevelt and Reagan were very different presidents in terms of their political ideologies, I think their leadership style is very similar. So I don't know. Talk about my 5 through 12 list. What do you think?
I think Roosevelt is definitely fair. I think, point you made with the comforting leadership. I think even it takes a lot to be elected. He was elected 4 times.
Yes.
And then he really only served 3 terms though. But even looking at the way that the public mourned him after his death, I think that says a lot about the way that he made the nation feel as president. But I agree with everything you said on him. Reagan, I think very similar views there. Kennedy, I understand why you put him there. I knew that one would be a little controversial when I put him lower.
It's all right. It's all right.
I just can't get over. I think that I'm not necessarily saying that this is what you're doing, but I think that lots of times Kennedy being the only president to have been assassinated in kind of the television era, I think that his memory has lived on in a very different way, especially because also he was so young.
Sure.
And I think that has affected the way we kind of collectively remember him, and not to like totally diss Kennedy or anything, because I think there are definitely positive elements there. I think he's upper half for sure. I think that I'm just not sure if he's so good to be top 10.
Okay.
But
That's
I
totally
understand
fair.
it. Eisenhower, I totally understand too. When we get to where I put him, I'll even talk about some reservations that I had putting him there. But I agree with everything you said. I'll probably elaborate on some of those points in a minute. Monroe, also totally agree. Era of good feelings, Monroe Doctrine. Similar things to me. I think top 10 spot is something that you definitely can make a good argument for him having. Same thing with Truman. Johnson, I definitely put him lower than you did, but I think there's nothing that you said that I really disagree with. I think that it really just plays in still to just which aspects of his presidency you really focus on.
Right.
Um, and same thing with Polk. I was doing a little risky there too. Not so much with you, but with I don't know if there's anyone who really keeps up with how historians rank the different presidents, but putting Polk in top 10 is pretty controversial. But we had similar reasons for putting him around the same area. So
Well, look, listen, I had on one of our earlier episodes that I put out on YouTube, I did have a James K. Polk account comment on a few of them and said that they liked the podcast. So
well,
I'll help them
they're
out
going to
there.
be this account is going to be very happy with us.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Hey, they'll like this rankings. I got him at 12. You got him at 8. So outside of obviously Kennedy and Johnson, for the most part, we have the other 6 in pretty similar areas in our rankings. Some I have higher than you do, and then vice versa. And so now, this is really, we talk about like the great of the great president. It's like there's no debate whatsoever. The country was in a better place when they left office than when they came in, and they had a direct impact on it. Again, we're talking household names here. We even covered a few that we were talking about now. So we will move now. So obviously for the YouTube audience, you guys saw I put like an 8 president spurts. We're going to do like 2 slots here. So we're going to do number 3 and 4 for Isaac's rankings and for mine. So 3 and 4 for Isaac. Let's put it up now. He's got Dwight Eisenhower at number 3 and Thomas Jefferson at number 4. So explain why you rank these two where you rank them.
Jefferson, I think, despite a lot of his personal failings, I think it's hard to argue against him having a top 5 spot. Um, he, you have the Louisiana Purchase, you have the Barbary Wars, which aren't talked about too much. I'm not even sure if we covered them.
I don't think we did.
Um, which is essentially just the U.S. fighting pirates off the
Right.
coast of like northern Africa and the Mediterranean. Essentially, um, you have the beginnings of kind of figuring out just how this government is going to work. So far as what we've already established with Washington and Adams, but after Adams saying, what do we do? How do we handle partisanship? How do we handle these different issues? And maybe what he did not as president can be criticized, but I think as president, I think his leadership was very strong. I think he did a really good job leading the country. People had a lot of confidence in him. He had, what I think at almost any other time in American history would be an incredibly controversial foreign policy style, but for the time, it matched what America needed perfectly, which was basically somebody that was going to tell the European powers what he was thinking.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and I think that those are all things that are just big credits to him. I think that if we hadn't had a Jefferson presidency when we did, I think America would look significantly different. Probably not for the better.
Yeah.
I think for Eisenhower, this one was a little risky too, putting him at number 3. I think he's one where maybe not quite as high as I put him. He's already normally ranked nowadays pretty high. I think he'll be um, ranked top 5. He's another one I would bet like I am with Bush, H.W. Bush. I
Yeah.
think that he's going to move up a little bit more for a couple reasons, and I'll point out there's a couple. First, I'll say there's 2 reasons why I could see why you could say maybe not for Eisenhower. One is that he had a couple health scares that lowered public confidence.
Mhm.
And 2 is at the end of his second term, there was kind of a feeling amongst the public that things were lagging behind a little bit. With the space race, specifically with Sputnik going up, and also just the fact that we had a president who was a little bit older, made people feel a little bit slower at that time when the country was booming in the way that it was. Now, this is why I put him at number 3. There's a couple reasons. One is because of his handling of Korea and ending the Korean War.
Good point.
I think he went in, he saw a mess that Truman had created. Not all of it's on Truman, but had been created during that administration, and he cleaned it up in a way that hadn't really been done before. Basically saying like we're okay with a stalemate, which is where we still are, was for the time ingenious. That was not something that had been done before. Um, so I think he deserves credit from that aspect. I think, overall the economy did well in the 50s. And I think, we talked a lot about his kind of subtle civil rights advances. And I think where America was at the 50s, I think that he was in a difficult space for how you handle those things, but I think he handled them with a lot of grace. I think he helped to move people along in a way where he didn't do anything that was necessarily going to tear the the entire country up, but was also consistently supporting the rights of African Americans, and working on their behalf, to make America more equal. And I think that that is highlighted in his response to Brown v. Board of Education and the way that he carried that out. Um, I think those are all things that really push him forward. I think his handling of the beginning of the Cold War is really strong. I think that he put on a really tough face to the Soviets, and I think he was able to do that without really perpetuating the war itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that those are all strengths that he has. And that is why I felt like I could give Eisenhower a number three spot. And I think that people are moving that way with me a little bit. I'm not sure if they would put him quite number three, but I think maybe number 4 or 5 is where most people will settle. But I felt pretty good putting him at a number three.
Yeah, and again, like I said, he is certainly, his ranking is slowly climbing as we see, with when these lists come out every year. And you make a great case for Eisenhower. I mean, I think when you look at something that he deserves a lot of credit for, that maybe some do and some don't get credit for, is America is, in terms of foreign policy and then certainly domestically, in a very stable place.
Mm,
And I think a lot of, and we see this, we talked about this when we talked about Eisenhower in, I think it was episode 7, that part of the reason, in my opinion, that we had the candidates that we did in 1960, again, 2 guys under the age of 50 in Nixon and Kennedy, was because, like you said, it did feel like maybe America was lagging a little bit in the space race, which is something that Eisenhower, did discuss in the last year of his presidency, but it wasn't like necessarily at the top of his agenda, obviously, with his presidency coming to an end. And also with this sort of, uh, I guess in a negative way, sort of the grandfatherly image of Eisenhower, I think he sort of reasserted himself as a strong leader again with his farewell speech.
mhm.
And I think he does deserve credit for that. I don't know if I put him at 3, but listen, if somebody wanted to put him at, like you said, 4 or 5, I think you could have a very strong case for that. And who knows, maybe one day down the road, when we, maybe we do this in 2032, Eisenhower will be the consensus number 3, and you'll get to gloat, because look, it's a strong case. I agree with you. And again, with
I
Jefferson,
I think, well, I
yeah,
was
go
gonna say
ahead.
one more thing with Eisenhower that I
Yeah,
think has made him for a long time, which is why he's slowly risen in kind of, historians' rankings. I think a lot of that has to do too with he had more of a subtle leadership. When you
mm,
have somebody that has a huge tragedy or crisis that they have to respond to, it makes it easier, because with those sorts of things, you can much more easier. I can look at a James Buchanan and easily say he did a bad job with this major crisis. And
right.
that kind of is a shadow over his whole presidency. And I can look at someone like George W. Bush, who had some missteps in his presidency, but I can say the way that he responded to 9/11 was really good, and that is a shadow over his whole presidency. And I think that, either way, those are, they're not every president, but there are a lot of presidents that have those that can at least help kind of lean them on to one side or the other. And I think Eisenhower is a little bit harder, because even though there are definitely good things that I, we just talked about and discussed, and there are some imperfect qualities there, just as with any president. I think what makes him harder is that, the subtlety in the way that he governed was such an important part of what made him a good president for the time. And I think that's why he's slowly risen. Is I think that it's taken a while to kind of see all of that nuance and to kind of understand what he was trying to do and the way that he implemented things quietly.
I got you. No, that's a good
Mm.
point. And look, listen, man, leadership does not have to be, big and boisterous. Like it doesn't.
Oh,
There are, like I've always talked about on my sports show, that there are different ways to lead, and to be a leader on a team, and the leader on this team, in the case of America, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, in a lot of ways was very similar to how he was as a general,
uh-huh.
and really, wasn't the type of guy who necessarily wanted to get all the credit for everything, like maybe some other presidents did. He was very much a do your job type of guy, right? So
Mhm.
yeah, I think he deserves credit. And again, like I said, Jefferson seemed like he's in a good spot because actually, I'll show my rankings here. You and I both have Jefferson at number 4,
Mhm.
and I have Teddy Roosevelt number 3. Starting with Jefferson, like you said, he had a number of personal failings, but I think in terms of his time as president, certainly the high point is the Louisiana Purchase. It's not even debatable. It's the
Yeah.
greatest bargain in American history. The fact that we basically more than double the size of the country for a mere, even at that time, a mere $15 million. I believe you told the story about how during the negotiations they were like, "Wow, we're getting this for this."
Yeah.
It's quite mind blowing, and Jefferson deserves a ton of credit for it. And I believe something that I also give Jefferson credit on that I think all leaders have, and we'll see this later on. We talk about obviously Abraham Lincoln, is the ability to pivot off of certain positions, right? The style of financing that it took to finance the Louisiana Purchase was
Mhm.
one that he had opposed for years in Washington's cabinet with Alexander Hamilton. And so I guess he sort of comes to realization like, hey, this may actually work. And he implemented that, and again, at more than double the size of the country. So that's where I got Jefferson at number 4. Again, as a human being, I'm not a fan of his at all. But as a president, he did a pretty darn good job.
Mhm.
Teddy Roosevelt, I'm just going to confess, but Teddy Roosevelt might be my favorite president outside of Abraham Lincoln. I love the guy because,
He's a lot of people's favorite president, and there's a good reason for that.
of course, I mean, you're talking about, obviously, we talk about the energy and all that, but I think something else too for him is that there isn't a crisis that he has to respond to, yet he feels something deep down inside him. Hey, I feel like I have to help these people with the
Mhm.
position I'm in. Again, in some cases, he did exceed the role of president in doing so. But again, I think you hit on it perfectly when you talked about him being your number 5 president. That obviously you have the national parks, and I believe he
Mhm.
preserved through his policy in that he preserved like 230 million acres, including the Grand Canyon, because there were talks about getting rid of that. And
Mhm.
he had such a passion for the outdoors and for this natural American land that, hey, we have to preserve this. And like you said, he's got a national park named after him.
I
You
think also,
Yeah.
you brought this up when we were talking about my ranking of him, and this is something that I don't know. I looked through my notes. I don't know how I this just didn't really come to mind when I was thinking about it. But his work on labor issues
Yes.
was really important, and has definitely been. Um, when I was kind of talking about how there are a lot of ways that a lot of the things that we still debate about are things that Teddy Roosevelt touched on, but part of it was because we're arguing about whether we should really not about whether we agree or disagree with what he did, but to what extent we should do it.
Yeah.
And I think that labor issues are definitely one of those. Like, the idea that we would have virtually no labor laws in America now seems like such a foreign concept to the way that we view just the lens that we even look at labor issues in America. Like, that is not even on the table remotely. And at the time, that was a massive debate, and he laid down the law, sternly and swiftly, and people came on board. And I think that's one thing, and him looking at kind of the humanity of the situation, that balanced with the policy standpoint, and seeing how involved should the government be in this sector, while still also protecting people. And I think that I think it's a difficult balance to strike. I think, and sometimes you could criticize Roosevelt in some ways that he did that from a governmental standpoint, but I think that, like, overall, I think that he's one of the presidents that has handled that the best.
Definitely, and again, like just on the points you mentioned about labor laws and having clean food, you talk about obviously the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act that he got passed. You talk about even too. I think this is significant. I think it was 1902, but I know it was early in his presidency when you had the coal miners go on strike, and which could have been a disaster for the Northeast. And he steps in, he gets these powerful people to come to an agreement, and thus the coal miners go back to work, and thank God that the Northeast doesn't freeze. So again, I think again my admiration for him in that he didn't have like a major crisis, yet he felt the need to help the American people in whatever ways that he could. Yeah, I mean, outside of Lincoln, I love Teddy Roosevelt. He's one of my favorites ever.
Uh,
Okay, so this is a moment of truth. Number one, number two. I mean, I think at this point everybody knows who the top two is for Isaac, myself, and really every list has most lists has these two in the top two. It's just what order. So let's look at Isaac Lawson's number one and number two presidents of all time. He has George Washington as our greatest president, with Lincoln, I would certainly assume, as a close second. So explain why you rank these two one and two where you did.
so originally I put down Lincoln as number one, and then I went back and changed it. And there was a reason why, because it's always difficult about which spot you want to put these two in, and maybe it seems unfair to just kind of assume that they're going to be the top two, but I think there's a reason why they're there on almost every list.
Of course.
Um, and I'll explain why, but first I'll talk about Lincoln. Lincoln is my number two spot because um, he was able to lead the country through a civil war and was able to reunite the country.
Mm-hmm.
All while that's going on, is able to address the most hot button issue probably in the country's history, and is
Right.
able to come down clearly on one side of it, enact sweeping changes in the way that the government is responding to that issue, settle it pretty clearly, um, and do all of that, and then still come out of it on the other side looking like really good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the thing. I think there are so many situations where you look at presidents that were going through a crisis and try to enact sweeping legislation during that time. And there are none that I think look as good as Lincoln does on the other side of it. And I think one is because I think, obviously not with everything, but I think with a lot of things, I think there are a few issues that we face that are as clearly a moral issue as slavery was.
Right.
Um, but I think the way that Lincoln carried himself and handled himself during the war, I think the care that he showed to Americans, including Americans who were in rebellion against the Union, I think is something that is just like almost like it is just above the average human,
Yeah, it
like
is.
above and beyond. And I think that all around he was able to sympathize with people. He was able to hear their struggles. He was able to work for change. He was able to. It's funny that a president at a time when the country was more divided than ever was able to unite people.
Yep.
He was able to do what he thought was right, even when it was unpopular. I think, I can't really imagine putting Lincoln in a lower spot.
Right.
Um, Now that said, there's a reason why I put Washington in first and not him. Washington has the benefit of being the first person there. There's everyone is being compared to him because he was the first guy. Um, I think that's something that obviously people have pointed out before. I think the thing that helps Washington the most is that he's someone who did not want to be president. Um, he was really the only president that was like recruited for the job.
Right.
And I think that at the same time, the balance that you need to have with that is that he is someone who really cares about the country and he cares about the ideology behind the country. He is a true believer. And I think that that is a perfect balance for a first president, especially in a country that was as unstable as it was during that time. He is somebody that really sincerely believes in this union. He's somebody that really sincerely believes in this constitution, and he is going to sell it to the people. He's going to prove that it works. He's going to do that, and he did. And I think I really can't imagine in America with any there were a lot of the founders were great men, but I can't. I really have trouble thinking of another founder that I think could pull off the first presidency as well as Washington did.
Right.
And I think that trying to unite all of these states that are for the we're functioning pretty independently, being able to get them to work together, to be able to understand that like they're part of one larger country and they're not all independent countries that are just kind of like allies. Being able to keep them united is a big deal. I think being able to stop Great Britain from coming back, being able to clearly mark out that the U.S. is going to work in its own interest, and not get too wrapped up in foreign entanglements like he had to decide to do when France and Great Britain were at war, and be able to make a hard decision there. I think that there are so many aspects to Washington's presidency that I think put him in that number one spot for me. The reason why he has it and Lincoln doesn't is because of this. Because Washington was working on like formulating the union, he was working on creating it, and Lincoln was working on preserving it. And I think
Right.
preserving it is a really, really hard job. And I think that Lincoln definitely deserves a ton of credit for it. But, you know, Lincoln would not have been there if it wasn't for Washington, if that makes sense.
That's a good point.
And I think that that is what makes it so significant. Is that Washington is this predecessor that like I said, I really I don't think that this American experiment would have gone on as long if we had had somebody else, leading our country for that first go around. And I think that that's why he gets the number one spot for me. But either one of them, I think there are fair arguments either way. So
Yeah, you could make that case without a question. And I think what's interesting about Washington is every single thing that he did was a first for the office. Every single thing
mm-hmm.
he did. It's the only president where that has been the case. And and I'll sort of talk about where I have them ranked in just a second. But I mean that's certainly a more than not just fair, but I would argue go so far as to correct position to take that without Washington, there's no Lincoln,
Mm-hmm.
right? There is no union to preserve or to save because what Washington did was not just establish not just like the identity of the country, but the identity of the presidency. And again, this is a
Mm-hmm.
president's show, and what being president is all about almost entirely goes directly to the first guy who did it, because
Mm-hmm.
every single thing he did was precedent setting. And so look, he deserves a ton of credit for the way that he was able to make that happen. And again, with
One
Lincoln, go ahead.
sorry, one other thing that I'll add to another thing that played into their placement as 1 and 2 is that Lincoln had to bend the rules while he was in office. And I think it's
Right.
understandable why he did. And I think it's one of those scenarios, kind of in the same way with Teddy Roosevelt, where it's like, if this was anybody else, then I wouldn't be okay with it.
Yeah.
But Lincoln was somebody else who also, like Washington did, was a true believer in the unity of the states and in the Constitution. But he had to bend rules to be able to preserve the Union, which will, I think, he made the right call at that time in that extraordinary situation. But I think the fact that Washington didn't have to bend rules and didn't, I think that helps him too here.
And these are the two. I don't think any presidents have ever had as much pressure as these two did,
Mm-hmm.
for those reasons. In Washington, like you said, he didn't really want to be president, and I believe he had the famous letter, or I don't know if it was in like his diary or whatever, but he wrote that I fear my countrymen will expect too much of me,
Uh-huh.
and ultimately Washington was exactly who we needed for that time, for this new office, for this new position. And what is it going to be? And I think if you would have told anybody at that time that the precedence that Washington is going to set is going to very much be relevant and matter, nearly 250 years later, I don't think they would have believed us. But
Uh-huh.
that's what it comes down to for him. And again, like I said, these two face more pressure than any president in history. So yeah, you make a good case for both. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right to my number one. The number one on my list of the greatest presidents of all time is William Henry Harrison. No, I'm just kidding. No, we're not doing that. No.
Hey,
What's that?
probably the least controversial president we've ever had. So
That is true. There's not one thing you can criticize that man did. Now, of course, outside of going out with basically no overcoat or anything and getting sick and dying of the flu. But anyways, top two. Let's, in all seriousness, I've got it reversed. I've got Lincoln number one. I've got Washington number two. I'm coming from the other end of the spectrum in that,
Mhm.
like you mentioned, you make a great case that without Washington there is no Lincoln. Sort of the case that I make, and I'd like to hear sort of your take on this, is that if Lincoln doesn't preserve the Union, if the South does win the Civil War, and it's assumed that the two the two areas of the country basically break apart for good, I think Washington's actions are arguably rendered irrelevant. Like
Mhm.
that's kind of the case I'm at. As important as they were, and again, they still matter to this day without a question. And again, every decision every president makes, in some way points to George Washington and how he comes in. I think when you talk about the stress that Abraham Lincoln had to go through, you can't really even imagine how a human being can handle that.
Hmm.
And obviously, everybody knows about how Lincoln looked when he came in 1861 until right before he was assassinated in 1865. How much he aged in just that 4 year stretch. And I mean, I think when you look at how he changed his stance in certain positions, I mean, because he said coming into the Civil War, he told, I believe it was an aide, or I don't know if it was somebody from his cabinet, that if winning the Civil War means keeping slavery around, then I'll do it. And then sort of coming around to that, changing his view, like, no, we have to not only win the war, but we got to end this injustice that has been going on for so long,
Hmm.
since the beginning of America.
Or even the side that's like, there is this literal physical war here, but with two sides fighting each other. But
Right.
also he's looking at it and saying, but looking at the root cause of it and saying, is the war really won if we come out of it and we're still at the same place we were on slavery?
Right. Right. Exactly. And I think that handling that, obviously, like you mentioned, he exceeded his power. But let's be honest, Lincoln didn't have a choice; he had to.
Hmm.
And obviously, you talk about with the Emancipation Proclamation. We've talked about bad and great pieces of legislation. Again, this is probably the greatest piece of legislation ever passed. Being able to free the slaves and end it once and for all. And just sort of the mindset of somebody who is, and keep in mind, Abraham Lincoln was somebody who, even in his personal life, dealt with a ton of tragedy. He lost his mother at a young age. Obviously, he lost one of his sons just like a year into office. So
Uh-huh.
you're talking about balancing all these personal tragedies and even his own health problems with with the greatest crisis that America's ever faced. I think it's again, without Lincoln, we talked about, Jefferson. He was at number 4 for the two of us. America would look very different today. I don't think there's any president you can say that more so than Abraham Lincoln. Like America, or even heck, this continent, for example, really wouldn't
Uh-huh.
look the same as it did when had he not been president.
I think that's all a really good argument. I think your comeback to uh there's not a Lincoln without a Washington thing. I think your comeback
Yeah,
with that there's not really a Washington without a Lincoln is definitely fair. Definitely fair argument.
yeah,
Um I think, I think our disagreement with this placing really shows why there is so much. Why, like, every list you look at, it's going to be one of these two. They're
yes,
going to be the top two, and I think that shows why, like, it is really difficult to rank these two, because they're both coming in with such difficult challenges. Like Lincoln had the bloodiest war, was president during the bloodiest war in American history, and all the casualties were American.
right.
And you have that, and you have all those stresses, like you said. And then with Washington, you have all those stresses of, like, is this really going to work? Like, I think sometimes now it's easy to forget how uncertain things were at that
Mhm.
point in time, or even during the time of the Civil War, um, because we know how it turns out. So I think for either of them, I think, I think in some ways you actually see similar issues here about them having restraint when it comes to power and knowing when to kind of exert that executive authority when they needed to. Um, Knowing, I think, they both had a way with words. I think that's something that definitely has stood out about both of them and their lasting legacies. Um, the way that they handled themselves while in office, I think the way that they put on that stress and were able to, um, like you said, for Lincoln, superhuman. I think Washington had got to a point where near the end of his administration, his hands were so shaky that he couldn't write anymore, and he's
Mm.
still handling this, and is still facing calls for a third term. And is able to um, look and say, I can't continue to do this, and it's not good for the country for me to continue to do this. I think it's, there's so many different elements of the two of them, and the way that they both were such defining figures in the office. I think there's a reason why they're always the top two.
100%. Again, you're talking about, excuse me, you're talking about very a similar sort of um, I don't know about mindsets, stresses, because again, these are very different, issues and problems that they're dealing with. But uh, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. You're talking about with Washington, the restraint to, again, everybody knows Washington could have been president for the rest of his life if he wanted to
Hmm.
be, because the American people would have kept voting for him.
Hmm.
But sort of these incredible. And here's something too, Isaac. The thing that these two shared, I think, even above any other trait, is they had an incredible innate sense of self-awareness, knowing what was good, when to use their power, when to sort of step back,
Hmm.
and really to understand that maybe they weren't necessarily the smartest person in the room, and they wanted to, Washington, for example, this cabinet. Like I'll use but the examples for both. Washington, again, one of the many presidents he set was the importance of putting a good cabinet together, and putting these minds who differed, greatly in their beliefs, and being able to get them to come together in a room and work things out. I think is admirable. And then in the case of Lincoln, Lincoln's not a war buff when the Civil War starts, which could be a
Hmm.
disaster for the Union. But for the next year, for the first year of his presidency, he is constantly reading about war strategies. When he talks to generals, he doesn't want to sort of be like just nodding his head in agreement with everything. He wants to know what is going on because he
I,
cares
I
so
I
deeply
think
about.
even you bringing up Washington's cabinet, both of them have been known for having, two of probably the greatest cabinets ever constructed by a U.S. president.
Right.
Washington's with, they're all founders there. Some of the greatest minds that we've ever had in this country. But with Lincoln, you have people who, like Washington's, had people who had drastically different views on things. Lincoln's was also very diverse on what areas of the nation they were from. Being able to get perspectives from a country that was not as connected as it was today. You had very different cultures in different parts of the country. Those are things that I think definitely play into it as well. And maybe again, I keep saying not going to get into current events, but
Yeah.
maybe that's something that maybe more modern presidents need to take a cue from. Is I think restraint is always something good for a president to have. And we talked about that, but I think maybe looking at the cabinets and saying, I should have a cabinet with a lot of diverse voices, not just in I think in political ideology, but also in their background and what part of the country they're from. I think that's something that we see with both Washington and Lincoln.
It is, and look, even sort of to piggyback off your last point there, that's kind of what we talk about is, I mean, with the elephants in the room, man. This, I guess, sort of talking about Lincoln. Again, elephants in the room. This country is, in my view, more as divided as it's ever been since the days of the Civil War. And I think
Hmm.
what people talk about, and what we need to do a better job of as Americans, and I guess this is sort of my closing message, is to have discussions with people who are different from us. Like you said, different backgrounds, different parts of the country, different
Hmm.
political ideologies, like being able to sit down at a table and discuss things. And yeah, you make a great point. Both Lincoln and Washington did these things. And look, man, at the end of the day, you've got Washington one, I've got Lincoln one. But at the end of the day, there is literally no debate that you can make that these are not the two greatest presidents of all time.
Hmm.
You can't make that debate,
Yeah.
or that argument. So okay, so there you go. That is the end of the Carving It Up U.S. Presidents Edition, episode 10. Isaac gave his list. I gave mine. There was some that surprised me on his list. I'm sure there was some of mine that surprised him. And yes, like I said, we need to come back like 10 years from now and like re-rank the list, because that's what I love about these when I read them every year on, like, C-SPAN and stuff like that. Like, they
Hmm.
change so drastically from 7-8 years ago. Like that's
Yeah.
and I think some of that is how we compare them to the current presidents, and how, like, oh, maybe they weren't as bad as they seem, or maybe they weren't like that great. So I mean, that's what I think is really fun about these lists. So episode 10, man, this has been a great series. I've had a blast doing with you, Isaac.
Hmm.
And any last words to close out the Carving Up U.S. Presidents Edition?
Yeah, I'll keep it short. I think the presidency, we talked a little bit, I think at the very beginning of the series about why each of us were interested in the presidency. And I think it's one of those things that I think really marks where the American people are at different times, for better or worse. I think is each president, because they are elected by the entire country. We see a segment just does like a snapshot of who America is at that point in time, and the issues that they're working through. And we've seen that consistently. And again, for better or worse, sometimes it is hard to look in a mirror. But I think that something that the presidency does is that it is that mirror for us. I think it's one of the reasons why I've always been so interested in it, is because I'm very nerdy. I love the kind of governmental paperwork side of things. I love reading about that. But I think also you get to see America.
Hmm.
And I think that, I think the presidency, if anything, should make us feel optimistic that throughout all the things we've gone through, throughout all the different challenges that this country's had, throughout presidents who have not responded well to things, despite the James Buchanans, we've also had the Lincolns and the Washingtons. And I think that that is the thing that really highlights it. I think with, quite frankly, with maybe the exception of John Tyler, I really do think that every president on that list, did care about America and the direction of the country. And I think that that is something that we can pay attention to and kind of take to heart. And I think that there are lessons from every presidency that we can use when evaluating what we should be looking for in our next president. And I think that that's something that hopefully everyone keeps in mind. You talked about just for briefly about the levels of partisanship in the country today. I think um, one thing, and this will be the final thing that I add about this, is just that partisanship is it's like a disease, and it doesn't. I think if we've talked about, it's come up plenty of times. We're talking about different controversies and things that have gone on in different administrations. Um, it has never led to anything good. Partisanship has never led to any good policy. It has never led to any good spots for the country, and I think that that's something that's important to remember. That the times that have generally been the best, the presidents that oftentimes that were rated the highest, with again maybe the exception of Abraham Lincoln, are the presidents that were there when they were able to get the most bipartisan work done, and they were able to cross those political aisles and unify America. And I think those are just important things to think about while we are at a time in America where partisanship is higher than ever. But that's kind of my final comments. I want to thank you for having me on the show. I've had a really good time. I am a listener to your coverage of sports, which is a little out of my normal topic of conversation, but I really enjoy the podcast. It's been great being on here. And I just want to thank you for inviting me. I've really enjoyed this series.
Listen, man, there's not anybody else that I would have rather had, doing the show with, because like I said, sort of your perspective. Yeah, look, I'm somebody. I said at the start of the series, and I think it shocked a lot of people. Like I've been studying presidents longer than I've been studying sports, and like so this has always been something that has been at the top of my interest list, if you will. And but you've got me beat on a lot of areas, certainly in terms of government and things of that nature. So yeah, I think you had a great message at the end. I mean, like you said, man, partisanship is never it never ends well. And so being able to keep that in mind, not just for those in power who certainly could take a lot from that message, but also just the common American people. I've always
Mhm.
said, anytime I've discussed, not even necessarily politics, but even when stuff like this has come up on my show, that
Mhm.
look, man, people lean liberal, people lean conservative. For the most part, the vast majority of America, we're pretty close together. Some people lean this way, others lean that way. But at the end of the day, everybody's rooting for the good of America, right? We're
Mhm.
all we're all hoping for this country and frankly the world to be a better place, and for America to be sort of the driving force behind that. And so yeah, at the end of the day, this is an office that has evolved and changed drastically since George Washington now to the current times. And I have no doubts that it's going to continue to change, and hopefully for the better. So Isaac, had an absolute blast doing this series with you, my man. And take care. Hopefully, we can do something like this soon, man.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
That was Isaac Lawson. And again, he he summed it up. This is this is a country that has been through a lot, to say the very least. So we could do a whole podcast on all the issues that we dealt with. It kind of be kind of depressing, but at the end of the day, it's this is a resilient nation, man. We've been through a lot, and like Isaac said, the president is often a mirror for where the country is at in many cases. So just continue. Like my message would be, man, stay active, stay aware of what's going on, and let's hopefully we can elect more. Well, hopefully not for the times, or for what the times. Hopefully we don't need any more Abraham Lincolns, but people with that sort of mindset, and even like a Washington or either the Roosevelts, Reagan, Jefferson, Eisenhower, all those great presidents. So hopefully until we do something like this in the future, I hope everybody had a great time enjoying this 10-part series. Had a blast doing it. A big thank you to my man Isaac. And yeah, that's the end of the series. So hope everybody has a great day. Stay safe out there. God bless you all. Peace out.